In the quiet corridors of memory, the idea of power often hums like a distant machine, steady, alluring, and dangerous. We chase it believing it will make us whole, yet in its pursuit, we are slowly reshaped by its weight. Perhaps no story reveals this more vividly than that of Frank Lucas, a man who rose from obscurity to build an empire on ambition, discipline, and crime. His life asks a question we have yet to answer. Can control ever coexist with peace? Welcome to Biography Files Docs. Wherever you are listening from, whether it's late at night in a quiet room or on a walk through your own city's heartbeat, thank you for joining this circle of remembrance. You are part of a global web of listeners keeping history alive through reflection. If you wish to continue this journey through the lives that shaped our world, consider subscribing and let us begin. It began in the still air of rural North Carolina in the early years of the Great Depression, when survival itself was a daily act of defiance. Frank Lucas was born in 1930 in LaGrange, a place where the earth cracked under the summer sun and where the lines dividing black and white lives were as visible as the fences that split the fields. His family was poor, not by misfortune, but by design, caught in the system that turned labor into debt and hope into silence. He was a child of red dirt and quiet storms. The nights were long and the days heavy with the smell of tobacco and sweat. He often spoke later in life of how poverty wasn't just the lack of money, it was the presence of fear. He remembered, as many did, the sight of white landowners driving by in trucks while his family stood barefoot by the fields. It was not hatred he learned first, but humiliation. And humiliation, once it takes root, grows into ambition of the most unyielding kind. There was a story Frank would repeat in interviews, one that seemed to shape his moral compass, or perhaps the absence of it. He claimed he watched his cousin murdered by a group of white men for looking at a white woman. The men were never punished. Frank was 6 years old. The image, he said, burned into him like a brand. Whether that memory was truth or myth hardly mattered. In his mind, it became origin. It taught him that power, if not taken, would always be used against you. In those long southern evenings when the world grew still and only the crickets sang, he would stare at the horizon and dream of escape. Not freedom, escape. Freedom, he might have said, is a gift. Escape is earned. He began to steal from delivery trucks, small things at first. Candy, tobacco, anything that could be traded. He was not proud, but neither was he ashamed. He learned early that morality had less to do with right and wrong, and more to do with survival. By the time he was a teenager, Frank had grown restless. He was tall, strong, and quick to learn from the rhythms of those around him. He listened more than he spoke, a trait that would later become his sharpest weapon. The small town that had defined his early life began to feel like a cage. He would watch the freight trains passing through, carrying men and goods to places he could only imagine. To him, those trains were not machines. They were promises. Each whistle was a whisper of power, of the world that waited beyond the cotton fields. One evening, after another fight with his father over money, Frank made a decision. He would leave. There was no plan, only determination. He boarded a northbound train without a ticket, clutching a small bag of clothes and what little cash he had stolen from a local store. He did not look back. In the rhythm of the train wheels, he found the beginning of his story. The further he traveled, the quieter the past became. When he arrived in Harlem, it was like stepping into another universe. The lights, the music, the density of life, all pulsed with an energy he had never felt. The air itself seemed alive. Harlem in the 1940s was a tapestry of hope and danger, brilliance and decay. Musicians, hustlers, preachers, and dreamers all shared the same streets. It was a world that both welcomed and tested him. To survive here, one had to learn the art of adaptation. Frank found work wherever he could, Sweeping bars, shining shoes, running errands for local gangsters. He was invisible, but he was learning. Every transaction, every argument, every gesture was a lesson. He watched men who commanded respect not because of birth or education, but because they understood fear. Fear, he noticed, could move a man faster than loyalty ever could. At night, he would walk along Lenox Avenue, watching the streetlights shimmer against the wet pavement. He could feel the city breathing, restless and alive. It was in those moments he began to understand what he truly wanted, not just money or status, but control. The kind of control that makes others stop before speaking your name. He was not yet ready to claim it, but he could feel it waiting for him, like a current beneath the surface. Years later, he would describe Harlem as both a heaven and a hell. It was where he found opportunity and where he would one day lose himself completely. But in those early years, it was pure possibility. He was young, hungry, and unafraid of the world that had once frightened him. Still, somewhere in him, the boy from North Carolina remained, the one who had watched injustice and vowed never to be powerless again. That promise, whispered in the dark, would guide him for decades. It would make him rich, feared, and eventually alone. As the night deepened over Harlem and the last streetcar passed, Frank would sometimes close his eyes and hear the distant sound of the train he had taken north. The same rhythm that once promised freedom now seemed to pulse like a heartbeat beneath the city. Each echo carried a reminder. Power, once tasted, demands more. And so began the rise of Frank Lucas, not with violence or money, but with the quiet decision of a young man who refused to remain small. In the distance, a train whistle cuts through the silence once more, fading into the hum of the city. The whistle of that train seemed to dissolve into the hum of Harlem itself, the sound carried by the wind between the brick walls and neon signs, swallowed by the pulse of the city that never truly slept. For Frank Lucas, Harlem was more than a destination. It was a test. The first breath he took there filled his lungs with smoke and ambition, and he would later say that in Harlem, a man could become anything if he was willing to lose everything. The street stretched before him like a living maze, each corner offering either opportunity or destruction. Jazz drifted out of club doors, mingling with the calls of vendors and the laughter of men who hid their pain behind their sharp suits. To Frank, it was music unlike any he had ever known, a song about survival set to the rhythm of sin and salvation. At first, he was only an observer. He moved quietly through those streets, eyes open, his voice low. The first rule of Harlem was to listen more than you spoke, and he learned that quickly. He listened to the barbers gossip about politicians, to gamblers boasting of their winnings, to preachers warning about the devil in a city that seemed built for him. Every voice revealed a code, every gesture a lesson in power. Harlem was not chaos, it was order disguised as noise, and Frank's mind absorbed it all. He noticed who shook hands with whom, who carried respect in their walk, who spoke with calm authority while others shouted to be heard. He studied the way fear moved between men, invisible but real, like the heat that rose from the pavements in summer. He lived small then, sleeping in crowded rooms, eating what he could afford, watching others live the lives he wanted. But even in obscurity, his ambition never quieted. There was something about him that others noticed, a calmness that did not belong to the streets. He was not reckless like the younger hustlers, nor boastful like those who mistook attention for influence. He carried himself as if he already owned something unseen. The older men, those who ruled Harlem's informal economy, recognized that calm for what it was, a hunger disciplined by patience. It was this quality that eventually brought him to the attention of one man whose name carried weight beyond Harlem's borders, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy was not a myth to Frank. He was flesh and shadow, feared yet oddly respected. To many, Bumpy Johnson was Harlem's unofficial mayor, a man who mediated disputes, distributed money, and punished betrayal with elegance and certainty. He moved through the city with the quiet assurance of someone who understood that true power does not need to shout. To meet him was to see what Frank wanted to become, not just rich, but untouchable. It began simply a small act of chance, a job running errands, delivering packages that were never opened, messages that were never questioned. Frank's efficiency, his reliability, his silence made him indispensable. In Bumpy's world, silence was worth more than gold. Under Bumpy's gaze, Frank began to learn the second rule of Harlem: never mistake kindness for weakness. He watched as Bumpy dealt with rivals, sometimes with charm, sometimes with violence, but always with control. Control was everything. It was the difference between ruling and falling. Frank saw that Bumpy's power did not come merely from money or fear, but from discipline. He wore his suits pressed, his shoes polished, his words measured. He carried himself not as a criminal, but as a businessman in a world that refused to acknowledge his legitimacy. Frank admired that. He saw in Bumpy a reflection of what the world denied them both: respect earned by intellect and will, not granted by birth or race. But admiration is a dangerous thing when paired with ambition. While others worshipped Bumpy, Frank studied him. He wanted to understand how a man could create order out of the chaos that consumed Harlem. He noticed the way Bumpy paid attention to details others ignored: the timing of shipments, the tone of a conversation, the glance of a rival. Frank began to imitate this discipline, this patience. He stopped wasting time in bars or chasing easy money. He carried himself with quiet authority, and slowly Harlem began to notice. The city itself seemed to test him constantly. One wrong move could end everything. He saw men vanish overnight, swallowed by violence or prison. He saw how trust could turn into betrayal with a single whispered word. But Frank did not flinch. He learned to navigate the delicate line between loyalty and independence, between obedience and self-preservation. He was loyal to Bumpy, but never blind. Every instruction became a lesson, every mistake a reminder that weakness was unforgivable. At night, after long days running Harlem's invisible errands, he would walk alone down 125th Street. The storefronts would close one by one, their lights fading until only the neon glow of nightclubs remained. The laughter of those inside would echo faintly into the empty street, mingling with the sound of his own footsteps. In that emptiness, he felt both small and infinite. He imagined his name whispered in the same reverence as Bumpy's, his influence stretching across the same streets, his decisions shaping lives he would never meet. To others, these were just dreams. To Frank, they were inevitabilities waiting for their moment. Sometimes he would pause outside a pawnshop window, staring at the glimmer of watches and rings, symbols of what the world worshipped. But what he sought was not wealth for its own sake. It was respect. Money, he realized, was merely a tool, a language of power that others could not ignore. He did not crave its shine, but its silence, the way it could make men listen. He would one day use it not as a shield, but as a weapon. The years under Bumpy's wing would mold him, harden him, and teach him the dangerous illusion of order in a world built on corruption. Harlem in those years was not a city. It was an ecosystem where survival required both intellect and instinct, and Frank possessed both. He was still young, but already the rhythm of his life had changed. He was no longer the boy who fled the fields of North Carolina. He had become a man of purpose, shaped by the streets that had once threatened to swallow him. Sometimes, as dawn crept over the rooftops, he would stand on the corner and watch the city waking. The mist rose from the ground, and for a brief moment Harlem seemed almost peaceful, as if the night had washed away its sins. In that quiet hour, Frank would think of home, the small house, the fields, the family he had left behind. He felt no guilt, only inevitability. The boy who had once feared power was now learning to command it. And yet, somewhere beneath the growing confidence, a seed of restlessness began to take root. He was grateful to Bumpy, loyal even. But loyalty has its limits when ambition begins to outgrow its master. In Frank's silence, thoughts began to gather like storm clouds. Ideas about doing things differently, smarter, cleaner, with more precision. He had learned enough to know that the old ways, though powerful, were also fragile. Power, he believed, should not depend on fear alone. It should depend on control. One night, as he left a meeting at the club where Bumpy often held court, Frank paused under a flickering street lamp. The air smelled of rain and gasoline. He looked down at his reflection in a puddle, the city lights shimmering in its surface. Somewhere in that reflection, he saw both his past and his future. The boy from Lagrange staring back at the man he was becoming. Above him, the street lamp flickered once more before steadying. The sound of a blade snapping open behind him broke the stillness. A warning from the city, perhaps, reminding him that power was never free. The blade caught the light for only an instant, a brief flash that seemed to slice through the humid Harlem night. Frank did not flinch. The man holding it was young, desperate, perhaps new to the streets and unaware of who he was following. Fear and hunger made men foolish, and in Harlem, foolishness was a form of suicide. Frank turned slowly, his hands raised not in surrender, but in calm control, his voice steady as he spoke. He understood that power in such moments was not about violence, but about composure. He disarmed the man not with strength, but with words, asking him questions about where he was from, who he worked for, what he was hoping to gain. By the time the police siren echoed faintly in the distance, the boy had already dropped the knife and vanished into the alleys, leaving only the metallic scent of fear behind. That was Harlem's third rule. Violence was not strength. Survival was. Bumpy Johnson heard of the incident soon after. In Harlem, news traveled faster than truth. He summoned Frank to one of his usual haunts, a smoke-filled club where jazz brushed the air like whispers. The tables were lined with men who measured worth in silence and eyes that never rested too long on one thing. Bumpy sat in the back, his posture immaculate, his presence commanding without effort. He did not smile when Frank entered, only gestured for him to sit. There were no congratulations, no words of praise, only a long look, the kind that stripped away pretense. "You kept your head," Bumpy finally said, his tone flat. "That's the difference between a man and a fool in this business." It was both a compliment and a warning. Frank understood. From that night onward, Bumpy began to trust him with more responsibility. Small things at first. Collecting payments, ensuring deliveries arrived safely, keeping an eye on certain men whose loyalty wavered when money called louder than respect. Frank performed each task with precision, never drawing unnecessary attention. He kept his words few and his results clean. Harlem was full of noise, but he moved through it like a shadow. The older men began to nod to him in passing, the kind of acknowledgement that carried more weight than applause. Working under Bumpy was like attending a school of invisible law. Everything was structured, though nothing was written down. You learned when to speak, when to remain silent, when to act, and when to wait. Frank learned that Bumpy rarely lost his temper, not because he lacked emotion, but because he had mastered control. Rage, in Bumpy's philosophy, was wasteful. "You can't think when you're mad," he once told Frank over a quiet drink, "and if you can't think, you're already dead." These words lodged themselves deep in Frank's mind. He began to study his own impulses, his moments of pride and impatience, He began to understand that true power required the suppression of ego, the art of restraint. The city became his classroom. Each street corner was a lecture on human nature, each deal a study in trust and deceit. Frank noticed how men who seemed loyal could shift allegiance overnight when their fear outweighed their faith. He saw how greed blinded judgment, how a single careless word could unravel months of work. He learned to read faces the way gamblers read cards. Small twitches, flickers of uncertainty, the invisible language of lies. Harlem taught him that honesty was often just a mask worn by those who had yet to find a better disguise. But it was not all darkness. In those years, Frank also discovered something like purpose. He admired Bumpy not only for his intelligence, but for his strange sense of justice. To many in Harlem, Bumpy was both protector and predator, a contradiction that made sense only to those who lived within the city's rhythm. He donated to churches, paid rent for struggling families, helped bury the dead when their kin could not afford it. Yet he also ruled through fear, and his justice, though swift, was absolute. To cross him was to vanish quietly, your name remembered only as a warning. Frank observed it all and began to grasp a truth he would carry into his own empire. Morality was a luxury the powerless could not afford. Sometimes, late at night, when the clubs had emptied and the streets had fallen quiet, Frank would stay behind after a meeting, tidying the space as others drifted away. He would see Bumpy seated alone at a table, staring into a glass of whiskey, the smoke from his cigar curling upward like a ghost. There was something in the older man's stillness that spoke to Frank, a kind of loneliness that power could not erase. It was as if Bumpy knew that control was both a crown and a chain. Perhaps that realization came to every man who reached too high. Frank wondered if he, too, would one day wear that same expression of quiet exhaustion. One night, after settling a dispute between two rival numbers men, Bumpy motioned for Frank to follow him into a small back room lined with ledgers and photographs. On the table sat a chessboard mid-game. Bumpy gestured toward it without looking up. "You play?" he asked. Frank shook his head. Bumpy smiled faintly. "You should learn. Chess teaches you patience, teaches you that every piece matters, even the ones you think are small." He moved a piece deliberately, the soft click echoing in the still room. Most men lose because they don't look far enough ahead. They think only about the next move. You want to survive? You think 10 ahead. Frank nodded, though he understood that the lesson had little to do with the game in front of them. As months turned into years, Frank grew into his role. He began to carry himself differently, his movements measured, his voice steady even in chaos. Yet beneath that calm exterior, his mind never stopped working. He admired Bumpy deeply, but admiration could not suppress ambition forever. Every time he collected a payment or negotiated a truce, he imagined how he might do it better, more efficiently, more discreetly. He saw flaws in the old system, the dependency on unreliable couriers, the wasteful displays of violence, the constant risk of betrayal. He believed that power, to endure, must evolve, and somewhere in that belief, the seeds of his future empire began to germinate. Still, he remained patient. To move too soon would be suicide. He knew the streets were full of eyes and ears, and even loyalty could turn lethal if ambition was exposed too early. So he waited, learned, and built his reputation brick by brick, one silent success at a time. He learned that Harlem respected consistency more than charisma. Men came and went, shouting their triumphs into the night, only to vanish by morning. Frank's silence, his precision, made him stand out in a city addicted to noise. But as his power quietly grew, so too did the tension within him. There were moments, rare but undeniable, when he felt trapped by the very structure that had elevated him. Serving under Bumpy was both privilege and confinement. Every time Bumpy made a decision that Frank disagreed with, he felt the faint tug of rebellion within him. He never voiced it, but the thought lingered. Someday, the student would no longer need the teacher. Someday, the lessons from the shadows would be his to apply on a grander scale. The night stretched on, and the city's rhythm pulsed through his veins. Harlem was changing, the economy shifting, the underworld adapting. War abroad would soon bring new opportunities at home, though few yet understood the scale of what was coming. For now, the air was thick with anticipation, and Frank could feel history moving beneath the surface, slow but unstoppable. One evening, after closing the club, he lingered in that same back room where the chessboard still sat. The pieces remained where Bumpy had left them, frozen mid-battle. Frank stared at the board for a long moment before reaching out and moving a single pawn forward. The soft sound echoed faintly in the empty room. The move was small, almost invisible, yet it carried the weight of everything that would follow. The chessboard remained where it was, a silent monument to an unfinished game, the kind that never truly ends but simply waits for new hands to continue it. Frank left the club that night with the faintest sense that something in Harlem had begun to shift, though no one yet dared to name it. The city had its own rhythm, and those who listened closely could feel the changes before they were spoken. The whispers began softly, carried through the barber shops, through the alleyways behind the jazz clubs, through the circles of men who dealt in quiet business rather than public power. Bumpy Johnson was ill. At first, it was said to be nothing serious, a bout of exhaustion, the kind that comes from years of carrying a city's weight on one man's shoulders. But Harlem had always lived close to death, and the people who moved within its walls knew that kings rarely fade quietly. When the news finally came, it did not arrive as an announcement but as a silence that spread across the streets. One morning, the city simply felt different. The usual sounds, the laughter, the horns, the pulse of commerce, were dampened as if the air itself mourned. Bumpy Johnson was dead. To many, he had been more than a man. He was an institution, a figure who had woven his influence through every corner of Harlem. For Frank, the news hit with a stillness that he could not quite name. He sat alone in his room for a long time, the radio murmuring softly in the background, his eyes unfocused. The man who had been both mentor and measure was gone, and with him went the delicate order that had kept chaos at bay. The funeral drew a crowd unlike any Harlem had seen in years. Politicians, gangsters, preachers, and ordinary citizens all stood side by side, their heads bowed beneath the weight of loss and uncertainty. The church was heavy with incense and whispers. Frank watched from a distance, his expression unreadable, his thoughts circling the same questions that haunted everyone there. Who would hold the streets now? Who would keep the peace? Who would dare to fill the void that Bumpy had left behind? Around him, men exchanged glances that carried the flicker of opportunity disguised as grief. The city's hierarchy, long kept in delicate balance, trembled at the edges. Frank could feel it, like the first tremor of a coming storm. In the days that followed, Harlem began to splinter. The smaller crews, once held in check by Bumpy's authority, started carving out pieces of territory for themselves. Disputes broke out, some settled with words, others with bullets. The quiet order that had defined the old Harlem was replaced by noise and uncertainty. Frank observed it all without rushing to act. He had learned too well from Bumpy that power grabbed in haste is power lost in fear. Instead, he listened, he waited, and he watched the strong men destroy themselves with impatience. He spent his nights walking through the neighborhoods he once traversed as an errand boy, now moving with the calm awareness of a man who understood every shadow. The shop owners still nodded to him, the older ones especially. They remembered how close he had been to Bumpy, and that connection alone lent him a quiet authority. Yet Frank knew better than to mistake respect for security. Harlem respected only what it feared, and fear was currency that had to be earned. Still, something in him had shifted since Bumpy's death. The city seemed to speak to him differently now. Where others saw confusion, he saw possibility. In private moments, he thought of his old mentor not as a saint or sinner, but as a man who had built a fragile order in a world designed for chaos. He wondered if Bumpy had ever felt truly in control, or if power had merely been a way to delay the inevitable decay of all things. Frank often replayed their last conversations in his mind, small fragments of advice, warnings disguised as casual remarks. "You can't hold the streets forever," Bumpy had once said, lighting his cigar, his eyes lost in smoke. "You just try to keep them quiet long enough to breathe." At the time, Frank hadn't understood. Now he did. Power was not about permanence. It was about rhythm, knowing when to move, when to pause, when to disappear. The weeks after the funeral turned Harlem into a chessboard once again, but this time there was no one to move the pieces with skill. Alliances shifted, loyalties broke, and the police presence grew heavier. Frank kept his distance, operating on the periphery, careful not to appear ambitious. He understood that in moments of transition, survival depended on invisibility. Let the loud ones draw attention, he thought. The quiet man always outlives the noise. Yet deep inside, he felt the slow burn of conviction. If the city was to have another ruler, it would not be one who mimicked the old ways. It would be someone who could rewrite the rules altogether. At night, he dreamed of Bumpy's chessboard. In his dreams, the pieces moved by themselves, guided by unseen hands. The king had fallen, but the pawns continued forward, relentless, blind to the loss of their leader. Frank would wake with a start, his heart steady but his mind racing. He understood the symbolism too clearly. The game had not ended. It had merely changed hands. And though he told himself he sought only stability, he knew that what he truly desired was mastery. He wanted to control the game itself. There was one evening, several weeks after the funeral, when he walked past the club where he had spent so many nights beside Bumpy. The lights were dimmer now, the crowd thinner. Inside, the musicians played half-heartedly, their notes drifting through the smoke like ghosts. Frank sat at a table in the corner, ordering a drink he barely touched. He watched the people move, each of them trying to reclaim a sense of normalcy that no longer existed. It was then he realized that Harlem was waiting for someone to restore the rhythm, to impose a new kind of order, waiting for someone unafraid of the risks that such a task demanded. He left the club as the rain began to fall, light at first, then heavier. The streets shimmered under the glow of the streetlights, reflecting the distorted faces of passers-by. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled softly, echoing through the avenues. He walked without destination, his coat pulled tight against the chill, his thoughts circling like restless birds. The world had changed once before when he boarded that train north, leaving his boyhood behind. Now, it was changing again. Another chapter was opening, and this time he would not arrive as a witness, but as an architect. By the time he reached his apartment, the rain had turned to a steady rhythm, a pulse against the window that seemed to echo the beat of his thoughts. He stood there for a long time, staring into the dark streets below, the sound of thunder fading into memory. Somewhere deep inside him, a decision had begun to form, quiet but unshakable. The old king was gone. The board was open. Outside, the storm gathered strength, its voice rising and falling like the breath of the city itself. The storm lingered through the night, drumming softly against the glass, washing Harlem's streets clean of dust and rumor. When morning came, the city glistened under a pale gray sky, as if reborn, though the air still carried a kind of tension that spoke of unfinished business. Frank Lucas rose early, his movements deliberate, his thoughts clear. He had spent years learning the rhythm of another man's rule, and now the silence left by Bumpy's death felt like an invitation. Yet he moved without haste. The lessons of the past had taught him that power seized too loudly was power easily lost. The streets were watching, and Harlem, though hungry for order, was equally quick to devour those who claimed authority before earning it. He began his ascent the way he had begun everything, with observation. He studied the networks that Bumpy had left behind, tracing each connection, each weak link, each man whose greed exceeded his loyalty. What he saw disturbed him. The old system was crumbling under its own weight, built on corruption and middlemen, on men too reckless to understand subtlety. The Italian syndicate still controlled the bulk of the narcotics trade, dictating prices, dictating risk, using Harlem's men as expendable distributors. Frank saw the inefficiency, the waste, and behind it all, the arrogance of outsiders who saw black neighborhoods as both customers and servants. He understood then that if he were ever to rise beyond their reach, he would need to change not just the players, but the very structure of the game. The idea came slowly, like a whisper carried through smoke-filled rooms and quiet afternoons. If the Italians could import the product directly, why couldn't he? It was not ambition alone that drove him, but logic. The war in Vietnam had opened new routes, new connections, and with them, new opportunities. Men were moving in and out of Southeast Asia with little oversight. Planes came and went under military authority, cargo unchecked, and among the chaos of war, the boundaries between legality and survival had blurred beyond recognition. Frank began to think like a businessman rather than a street hustler. He did not see drugs as a vice to be sold, but as a commodity to be controlled. To control it, he needed to go to the source. But before he could move, he needed trust. The city was still fractured, its loyalties divided. Frank visited families who had once answered to Bumpy, offering quiet reassurance rather than promises. He did not speak of grandeur or revenge, only of stability. The word itself had weight. Harlem had grown tired of chaos. Men who had once competed began to listen. Frank's calm manner, his precision in thought and action, gave the impression of inevitability. He did not need to raise his voice to be heard. The more he spoke softly, the more people leaned in. He was not trying to be Bumpy's successor. He was building something different, something cleaner, more efficient, invisible from the outside. When he finally arranged his first trip to Southeast Asia, it was not with fanfare or partners, but with quiet purpose. He flew under a false name, carrying only a suitcase and an idea. The humidity of Bangkok hit him like a wave, thick and suffocating, the air alive with the noise of a city both ancient and newly corrupted by war. He met with contacts through intermediaries, men who dealt in everything from weapons to silk, men who understood that profit and morality rarely shared the same table. It was there, among the narrow streets and river markets, that he found what he was looking for: direct access to the raw product, uncut, pure, and inexpensive, compared to what was being sold in the United States. The man who made it possible was a cousin of his wife, an officer with connections in the Golden Triangle. Through him, Frank established what would become one of the most daring smuggling operations of its time: heroin transported inside the caskets of dead American soldiers returning home from Vietnam. It was a method both shocking and ingenious, hidden within the machinery of war and grief. The scheme was not born of cruelty, but of calculation. Frank understood that the only way to build something lasting was to eliminate middlemen, to control every step from production to distribution. He called his product Blue Magic, a name that would soon become both legend and curse. Returning to Harlem, he began to rebuild his network from the ground up. He recruited men he trusted, family members, childhood friends, people whose loyalty was not bought but bound by blood. He set strict rules: no excessive violence, no selling to children, no cutting the product. His heroin was purer, cheaper, and more consistent than anything on the streets, and within months demand surged beyond control. For the first time in Harlem's history, a black man had broken the monopoly of the Italian mob, creating an empire that operated with military precision. Frank managed his business like a corporation. Meetings were held in quiet apartments, not smoky bars. Money was laundered through legitimate enterprises: dry cleaners, real estate, car dealerships. He dressed not like a gangster, but like an executive, his suits tailored, his speech measured. To the outside world, he appeared as a successful businessman, polite, articulate, and impeccably composed. Yet behind that calm exterior lay a mind of relentless calculation. Every move he made was guided by efficiency. He despised waste, whether in product, emotion, or human life. Those who worked for him followed strict discipline, and those who disobeyed rarely did so twice. Still, beneath the surface of success, there was a tension that Frank could never quite escape. He had built his empire not merely out of ambition, but out of necessity, out of the conviction that control was the only way to survive in a world built to deny him power. Yet control, once attained, becomes its own addiction. The money piled higher, the cars grew faster, the suits finer, but the hunger remained. He would often walk through his mansion in Teaneck, the floors gleaming, the air scented with polished wood and wealth, yet feel an emptiness that no possession could fill. Perhaps it was the memory of North Carolina that haunted him still, the child who had once promised never to be powerless again. Power, after all, does not erase fear. It merely changes its shape. As blue magic flooded Harlem's veins, the city began to change. Dealers who once controlled corners found themselves working under his command or forced out entirely. Addicts spoke his name without knowing who he was, their lives bound invisibly to the choices he made behind closed doors. Even the Italian families took notice, their curiosity giving way to resentment. But Frank remained calm. He had anticipated their anger. What he had not anticipated was how deeply his empire would mirror the very structures he had sought to escape. The hierarchies, the betrayals, the silent decay that comes with too much success. Late one night, as he reviewed ledgers by the dim light of his study, he paused. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint sound of the city that had once raised him. The air smelled of rain again, the same scent from the night Bumpy had died. He realized, with a kind of distant clarity, that he had become what he once feared, a man who mistook control for peace. Still, he could not stop. The empire demanded movement, demanded vigilance, demanded more. In the quiet, he poured himself a drink and stared at the liquid slow movement, amber catching the light. Somewhere beyond his mansion's walls, a plane engine roared faintly through the night sky, carrying another shipment across oceans, another small victory in a game with no end. He listened until the sound faded into the distance, leaving only silence and the faint echo of his own breathing. The sound of the airplane faded into the quiet of the night, leaving Frank in that half-lit space between triumph and solitude. The glass in his hand trembled slightly as he set it down, the faintest reminder that even the steadiest hands are still human. Outside, the city pulsed, unaware of how much of its heartbeat now belonged to him. In Harlem, his name was rarely spoken aloud, yet its presence could be felt in every alley, every whispered deal, every folded bill. He had become a phantom ruler, a man whose power was measured not by visibility but by silence. The streets thrived on noise, men boasting of small victories, dealers shouting their allegiance, hustlers claiming the corners they would soon lose. Frank had no need for that. He was the unseen current beneath it all, the quiet architect of a kingdom that functioned with mathematical precision. His discipline was legendary, Each morning he rose before dawn, his routine as exact as a soldier's. He dressed not in flamboyant colors, but in tailored suits of muted tones, his tie knotted perfectly, his shoes polished until they caught the light like glass. He believed presentation was a weapon, clean, deliberate, and undeniable. Where others wore their wealth like armor, he wore his like language, subtle but commanding. His wife, Juliana, admired that restraint, though she also feared the distance it created. Even in their moments of quiet intimacy, Frank's thoughts were elsewhere, orbiting around shipments, routes, numbers, the endless machinery of an empire that could not afford rest. He loved her, or believed he did, but love, like everything in his life, was filtered through control. The operation itself was an organism of order. His relatives managed key territories, their loyalty bound by blood and fear in equal measure. Each man had a role, each task a place within the larger structure. There were no random acts, no improvisations. Frank despised unpredictability. To him, chaos was the language of fools, and fools died young. He often reminded his associates that the drug trade was not a game of luck, but of logistics. "We are businessmen," he would say in his calm, deliberate tone, "and business is about discipline." It was this philosophy that allowed him to succeed where others had fallen. He had turned crime into a system, and in that system, emotion had no place. Still, emotion crept in through the cracks. Harlem was changing beneath the weight of his success. The addicts multiplied, the streets grew thinner, and the laughter that once filled the blocks was replaced by the slow decay of desperation. Frank saw it, but he told himself it was inevitable. The world had always fed on weakness. He was merely capitalizing on its truth. He justified it through a quiet logic that sounded almost moral when spoken aloud. If he did not control the trade, others would. If he did not supply them, someone worse would. In that reasoning lay his peace, or the closest thing to it. Yet at times, when he walked through the neighborhoods in his dark coat, the air heavy with the smell of smoke and burnt sugar, he could not ignore the eyes of the children who watched from doorways. They stared not in awe but in quiet confusion, as if they could sense the contradiction of a man both protector and destroyer. Frank's church attendance never wavered. On Sundays, he sat near the front, his posture upright, his gaze fixed on the pulpit. The congregation respected him. They saw his generosity, his donations, the groceries he sent to struggling families. To them, he was a success story, a man who had risen from nothing to something. They did not ask where the money came from, and he did not offer. The preacher's words about redemption and sin washed over him like distant music, pleasant but irrelevant. He did not see himself as sinful, only practical. The world was built on exploitation. He had simply chosen to profit rather than suffer from it. Yet sometimes, during moments of stillness, when the choir's voices rose and filled the church with trembling light, he would feel a small fracture inside him, a doubt so faint it was almost beautiful. He would close his eyes and imagine the faces of those he had left behind in North Carolina, the fields, the train, the promise he had made to himself never to be weak again. That promise had been kept, but at a cost he had never paused to measure. He was not without moments of tenderness. His mother came to live with him, her presence grounding him in ways the city could not. She saw through his composure, though she rarely said so. Once, while visiting his mansion, she looked around the vast rooms and said softly, "You built yourself a palace, Frankie, but tell me, where do you rest?" He had no answer. She would sit on the porch in the evenings, shelling beans while he took calls inside, her voice humming old hymns that floated faintly through the air. Sometimes he would stand by the window, watching her in silence, feeling an ache he could not name. He was powerful beyond measure, yet utterly defenseless against her quiet wisdom. the empire continued to expand. Shipments arrived like clockwork. Money flowed through channels too complex for outsiders to trace. He diversified his holdings: real estate in New Jersey, nightclubs in the Bronx, legitimate businesses that gave his wealth a veneer of legality. For a while, it seemed unstoppable. But success, like addiction, breeds its own kind of blindness. The more Frank perfected his system, the less he noticed the small fractures forming at its edges: the jealousy among his brothers, the growing suspicion among law enforcement, the greed of men who mistook his calm for weakness. He had built his kingdom on discipline, but even discipline can erode under the pressure of abundance. It was around this time that he first heard the name Richie Roberts, a detective with a reputation for incorruptibility, a man as methodical in pursuit as Frank was in concealment. Their lives would never intersect directly, not yet, but destiny had already drawn a line between them, a quiet thread that would tighten with every success Frank achieved. For now, he dismissed the thought. The police had always watched, always whispered, but they had never come close. He believed he was too careful, too precise. One evening, after a long day of calculations, he stepped into his living room and stood before a large mirror framed in gold. The reflection stared back: impeccable suit, steady gaze, the faint smile of control. But as he looked closer, he saw something else, something almost imperceptible: a flicker of fatigue, the weight of endless vigilance. For a moment he thought of breaking the reflection, of shattering the image that had come to define him. But he did not move. He straightened his tie instead, adjusted his cuffs, and turned away. Outside, the first snow of winter had begun to fall, soft and silent, covering the city in fragile whiteness. It drifted down over the rooftops, over the alleys where his men worked, over the corners where deals were made and lives unraveled. From his window, it looked peaceful, almost pure, but Frank knew better. The snow would melt by morning, leaving behind the same city, the same hunger, the same endless machinery that fed on both hope and despair. He watched until the flakes blurred into the dark, his mind already moving to the next shipment, the next calculation, the next quiet battle. And somewhere in that stillness, beneath the hum of distant engines and the whisper of falling snow, he realized that invisibility was not freedom. It was exile. The snow melted into slush by morning, streaking the streets in dull gray veins that mirrored the fatigue Frank felt, but never admitted. He sat in the kitchen before dawn, the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant hiss of steam from the radiators, the only sounds breaking the quiet. The mansion around him was too large, too immaculate, filled with the echoes of a life he had built for the purpose of safety, yet which often felt like a museum of restraint. The coffee in his cup had gone cold, but he kept holding it, staring into its surface as if searching for an answer to a question he no longer knew how to ask. In the reflection, he saw his mother move softly in the background, her slippers shuffling along the tile, her voice humming an old tune. He never told her how comforting that sound was, how it reminded him of something innocent he had long since traded away. Family had always been his compass and his burden. He had brought them all close, surrounding himself with his brothers and cousins, convinced that loyalty sealed by blood was stronger than any contract. He gave them work, money, homes, and dignity in a world that had offered them little. He wanted to lift them above the hunger that had shaped their lives in North Carolina, to create something lasting, a dynasty that no one could take from them. But family, as he came to learn, carried its own kind of fragility. It was built on emotion, not order, and emotion was dangerous in his world. His brothers were loyal, yes, but loyalty did not always mean discipline. They wanted to live as kings, to taste the excess their brother so carefully restrained himself from indulging in. They flashed cash, wore jewelry, drove cars that drew attention. They mistook the fruit for the tree, and Frank, watching from a distance, felt both pride and dread. He tried to guide them as Bumpy had once guided him, with patience that masked irritation. "We're not gangsters," he would say quietly, his tone more warning than instruction. "We're businessmen. The difference is how long we last." But his words often landed like whispers against the noise of success. Harlem adored them. The streets celebrated their wealth, their swagger, the myth that surrounded the Lucas family. They became symbols of power, walking proof that men from their background could seize the world's forbidden fruit. Yet beneath the admiration was envy, and beneath the envy was danger. Juliana watched the transformation unfold with unease. She had married a man who promised safety, stability, a clean life built from discipline rather than chaos. Yet now their home was visited by men who spoke in code, who carried weapons out of habit, whose laughter was sharp with something that felt like fear disguised as loyalty. She loved Frank, but she did not always understand him. There were nights she would wake to find him gone, sitting alone in his study, the glow of a desk lamp outlining his stillness. He rarely spoke of his thoughts, and when she asked, he would offer vague reassurances. "It's business," he would say, as if that one word could hold back the tide of unease that had begun to creep into their marriage. Despite the growing tension, Frank remained convinced that family was his greatest strength. It was the foundation that set him apart from the others, the Italians, the street hustlers, the opportunists. He believed that trust was something only kin could provide. But trust, like power, is a delicate thing. It bends slowly before it breaks. The more he built, the more cracks began to show. His brothers quarreled over territory, over money, over pride. The same traits that made them bold also made them careless. He found himself cleaning up their mistakes in silence, shielding them from consequences they did not fully comprehend. Each time he did, a small part of him hardened. He began to realize that love without control was weakness, and weakness, in his world, was fatal. Still, he could not let them go. His mother often reminded him that blood carried obligations beyond choice. She spoke of forgiveness, of patience, of the ties that made a man whole. "You can't build a life alone, Frankie," she told him one evening as they sat on the porch, the air thick with the scent of lilac and gasoline. "A man without family is just a shadow." He listened, silent as always, but in his heart he knew she was wrong. A man with family, he thought, risked becoming a prisoner of love. Yet he did not say it. Her faith in him was the last thread connecting him to a part of himself that had not yet turned to iron. The contradictions multiplied as the years passed. He was both provider and warden, protector and oppressor. His home was filled with warmth and fear in equal measure. When his mother smiled at him, he saw pride in her eyes. When his brothers laughed at the dinner table, he felt a fleeting peace. But beneath that peace was the constant hum of anxiety, the awareness that every bond he cherished could also undo him. Power had made him untouchable to the world outside, but within his own circle, he was vulnerable in ways he did not know how to defend against. Sometimes, in the rare hours between night and dawn, he would walk through his mansion's hallways, the silence pressing against him like a weight. The portraits on the walls, family photographs, snapshots of smiling faces, seemed to follow him with quiet accusation. He wondered what legacy he was truly building. Would his family remember him as the man who gave them everything, or as the man who demanded too much? Would they see the empire as a triumph or as a cage? These questions did not disturb his sleep because he barely slept. He lived in the spaces between decisions, between shipments, between the small acts of control that kept the illusion intact. Juliana, in her quiet strength, began to distance herself emotionally, her voice softer, but her eyes sharper. She loved him still, but it was a love shadowed by fear, the kind that watches its object closely, waiting for a sign of humanity to return. She once told him, during an argument that ended in silence, "You think love is a system, Frank, but love doesn't obey rules." He said nothing. He had no language for love that wasn't built on structure. To him, love without order was chaos, and chaos was death. Outside, Harlem continued to pulse beneath the weight of his empire. The streets glittered with new money and drowned in new sorrow. Families celebrated the wealth that trickled down, while mourning the sons lost to the same empire that fed them. Frank saw it all and turned away, telling himself it was the cost of progress. But deep down, he knew the city was beginning to mirror his own house, rich, disciplined, decaying at the core. One evening, after a long family gathering filled with laughter and forced warmth, Frank lingered at the table after everyone had gone to bed. The plates were still scattered, the wine half finished, the candles burning low. He stared at the remnants of the meal, the crumbs, the fingerprints on glass, the faint smell of food cooling in the air. It was an image of plenty and emptiness all at once. He thought of his mother's words again, about family being the cure for loneliness. But as he sat in that vast dining room, surrounded by silence, he felt more alone than he had ever been. The clock ticked steadily, indifferent to his thoughts. In the distance, the hum of the city reached him like an echo of his own making. The empire, the family, the illusion of control. All of it pressed against him like the walls of a shrinking room. He closed his eyes, listening to the faint creak of the house settling around him, the sound of the refrigerator cycling on again, the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat. And in that stillness, he realized that love, like power, could never be possessed without being destroyed. The house was still when Frank rose before dawn, the sky outside a pale gray sheet that dimly reflected the city's restless pulse. He walked through the rooms barefoot, past the sleeping silence of his family, the marble floors cool beneath his feet. The world beyond Harlem had begun to fold into his empire now, a world of jungles and soldiers and cargo that crossed oceans under flags of grief. The connection to Southeast Asia had grown deeper, more intricate, more dependent on the machinery of war. In the beginning, it had felt almost abstract. Numbers on paper, shipments that arrived with quiet precision, money that multiplied in the darkness of ledgers. But as the years passed, the images on the television began to blur with his own memory, soldiers wading through mud, helicopters slicing the humid air, body bags lined in orderly rows under a foreign sun. Somewhere within those images was the hidden artery of his fortune. He could not admit it aloud, not even to himself, but he knew that every bundle of heroin that reached Harlem carried the scent of death from 2 continents. War had a way of distorting everything, even morality. In Vietnam, desperation was a language everyone spoke fluently. American soldiers traded their pay for escape, dealers risked everything for profit, and between them stood the quiet logistics that men like Frank had learned to perfect. The operation was seamless. The heroin, pure and blue-white, was sealed carefully, hidden among the bodies of the dead returning home. It was not an idea born from cruelty but from calculation, an exploitation of systems already steeped in corruption. The irony was unbearable if one thought too long about it. The war that was destroying lives abroad was feeding the empire that was destroying them at home. Yet to Frank, it was all one mechanism, one vast economy of suffering that the world had built long before he arrived. He simply learned how to turn it into order. He flew to Bangkok twice that year, each visit cloaked in the noise of commerce and the illusion of legitimacy. The city was alive with heat and contradiction, monks walking barefoot past bars filled with soldiers, the smell of incense mixing with gasoline. Frank moved through it like a ghost in a tailored suit, polite, observant, always slightly detached. The men he dealt with were not unlike himself, calm, efficient, uninterested in morality. They spoke of quantity and purity as if discussing fabrics or spices, their voices steady, their hands steady. Money changed hands in silence, and behind every polite nod was a calculation of risk. He admired their discipline. In their world, there were no pretenses of good or evil, only the precision of exchange. But sometimes, late at night, as he stood by the window of his hotel room overlooking the river, he would hear the distant rumble of artillery echoing from the jungle. It was a low, continuous sound like the earth breathing. The lights along the water flickered, and for a moment he felt as though he were staring at a reflection of himself. A man thriving amid destruction, building calm out of chaos. He wondered, not for the first time, whether there was any difference between survival and sin, or if the two were simply different faces of the same truth. He had long stopped believing in absolutes, yet there were nights when he could not silence the question. Back in Harlem, the streets glowed with the prosperity his empire brought. The money moved like water, steady, inevitable, cleansing those who knew how to use it. Businesses flourished, homes were bought. Men who had once struggled to feed their families now drove cars they could barely afford to insure. Yet beneath the glittering surface, the city was rotting. Addiction had spread like a quiet plague, invisible at first, then impossible to ignore. Frank saw the change, but refused to name it. To acknowledge the destruction would be to question the foundation of everything he had built. He told himself he was giving people what they wanted, that he was merely responding to demand. But deep inside, a small unease began to stir, a dull echo that grew louder each time he saw another body carried out of a tenement building, another child watching from a doorway as paramedics worked in silence. He had always told his men that violence was bad for business, that attention was the enemy. Yet even he could not control the chaos that addiction birthed. Harlem was beginning to suffocate under the weight of its own dependence. The police grew more aggressive, politicians spoke of cleansing the streets, and rival dealers, jealous of his dominance, began to move against him in desperate ways. Frank remained calm through it all, his mind always 2 steps ahead, his faith in discipline unshaken. But discipline, no matter how perfect, could not account for the randomness of human need. Every empire, he once heard Bumpy say, carries within it the seed of its own destruction. He dismissed the thought then. Now he could feel that seed stirring. Still, he moved forward. He expanded his distribution, refined his network, diversified his investments. He made deals in quiet restaurants, in church basements, in the back rooms of legitimate businesses that disguised their purpose under the hum of commerce. His face was rarely seen. His name, though whispered, was treated with reverence. He had become something almost mythical, a man too clever to be caught, too composed to be feared openly. The newspapers began to write about the epidemic sweeping New York, calling it a moral crisis, a war at home. Frank would read those articles over breakfast, his expression unreadable, his fingers tracing the lines of text as if they belonged to someone else's story. At night, the television played endless footage of Vietnam, bombs blooming in the distance, soldiers crouched in trenches, the faces of the wounded caught in the harsh light of cameras. The images of the war blurred with the reality of Harlem until Frank could no longer separate one from the other. The jungle, the city, the smoke, the loss. It was all one landscape now, an unending cycle of profit and pain. He began to drink more, though never enough to lose control. He told himself he needed the calm it brought, the illusion of distance. But even in those quiet moments, he could not shake the sense that the world had become too small, too connected, too fragile to contain what he had unleashed. One evening, after returning from another meeting that ended in veiled threats and uneasy handshakes, Frank stood in his yard as dusk settled over the house. The air was heavy, still carrying the faint chill of early spring. He looked up at the sky where a single plane traced a silver line across the fading light. For a moment, he thought of the soldiers whose bodies had carried his fortune home, of the families who had waited at airports for coffins sealed against grief. The thought passed quickly, like a shadow across his face. He turned back toward the house where the lights were warm and steady, where his family waited, unaware of the magnitude of what their comfort cost. Inside, he poured himself another drink and stared out the window, the ice clinking softly against the glass. The city lights shimmered in the distance, fragile and endless. Somewhere beneath them, men were dying, women were crying. Children were learning to live without hope. And somewhere far away in a jungle half a world from Harlem, the thunder of distant guns continued, low and steady, like a second heartbeat beneath his own. He listened for a long time, though there was nothing to hear but silence. And in that silence, for the first time in years, Frank Lucas felt the faintest tremor of doubt, small, fleeting, but undeniable. The doubt came quietly, like a draft through a sealed room, invisible yet impossible to ignore. It began as small interruptions in his certainty, a hesitation before a decision, a flicker of unease when he caught his own reflection unexpectedly. For years, Frank had lived with precision, every gesture measured, every word chosen with care. But as his wealth grew, so too did the noise around him, the uninvited laughter of men whose loyalty was bound only to the gravity of his power. He could feel them watching him, even in silence, their respect beginning to blur with fear. Power, he had always believed, was a form of control, but now it began to feel like surveillance, as if the very empire he had built were studying him back, waiting for the smallest crack to widen. His days were filled with movement, meetings, deals, the endless circulation of money through layers of concealment. And yet he often found himself lost in moments of stillness, staring at things that did not matter. A glass left half full, the slow spiral of cigarette smoke, the reflection of light on polished marble. These were small, irrelevant details, but they drew his gaze as if whispering that something in his world no longer aligned. Harlem was changing, not in the way of growth, but of fatigue. The wealth that once radiated pride now smelled faintly of decay. The dealers on the corners had grown reckless, their discipline crumbling under the weight of greed and addiction. Even his brothers, once careful and devoted, began to take risks that betrayed a kind of quiet desperation. They bought new cars, threw parties, courted the attention he had always avoided. Their laughter grew louder, and Frank found in it not joy, but carelessness. He tried to correct them with patience, as he always had. He reminded them that invisibility was their strength, that too much attention invited ruin. But they no longer listened the way they once did. The authority that had once been unquestioned now had to be asserted. An assertion was something Frank despised. It meant explaining, persuading, pleading, weakness disguised as leadership. The realization unsettled him. He had built his empire on obedience, and now obedience was beginning to waver. In their eyes, he saw both admiration and irritation, the resentment that often grows in the shadow of greatness. He began to wonder whether loyalty was simply fear wearing the mask of love. He found himself pacing more often, the quiet rhythm of his footsteps against the floor becoming a kind of meditation. The mansion, once a symbol of achievement, now felt like a fortress. Every sound carried meaning. The soft creak of a door, the whisper of movement upstairs, the distant hum of the city outside. Sometimes, late at night, he would walk down the long hallway lined with mirrors, each one reflecting a slightly different version of himself. He would pause and stare, not out of vanity but disbelief. The man looking back was no longer the young dreamer who had fled North Carolina. The face was harder, the eyes deeper set, the expression a mix of calm and exhaustion. There were moments when he did not recognize himself, when the reflection seemed to belong to someone else entirely, a stranger wearing his own skin. It was during one of those sleepless nights that he noticed how quiet the world had become. Even his mother's presence could not soothe him as it once did. She had grown older, frailer, her steps slower, her eyes softer but filled with an understanding that frightened him. She rarely asked about his business, but sometimes in her silence, he sensed her awareness. Once, as she poured tea for him, her hands trembling slightly, she said, "You can't carry everything, Frankie. Sooner or later, something will break." He smiled gently, dismissing the words with the ease of habit, but they lingered like the aftertaste of a bitter drink. He had built his life to avoid breaking. Yet now, in moments of solitude, he felt a subtle fracture spreading beneath the surface. The police had begun to move more deliberately. He could sense it in the tightening of space around him, in the way conversations ended when he entered a room. He knew surveillance when he saw it. The cars parked too long, the faces that pretended not to look. He told himself he was prepared. His network was secure, his money clean, his roots invisible. But doubt does not respond to reason. It seeps in, slowly corroding the confidence that once seemed unshakable. Frank began to double-check every plan, reevaluate every ally, listen for nuances in voices that had never wavered before. He was not paranoid, he told himself. He was precise. Yet somewhere between vigilance and fear, the difference began to blur. His wife noticed the change before anyone else. She saw it in the way he hesitated before answering questions, in the nights he stood by the window long after the city had gone quiet. There were evenings when he would come home early, pour himself a drink, and sit in silence, his expression distant. She tried to reach him with gentleness, with reminders of the life they had built together, but he responded with calm detachment. Love, he believed, was another thing that required control, and control was slipping from his hands. One evening, while hosting a gathering meant to reassure his partners of his stability, Frank found himself drifting away from the conversation. Laughter filled the room, the sound of glasses clinking, the low murmur of men trading compliments they did not mean. He stepped aside and caught his reflection in a window, the city behind him a blur of lights, his own image sharp and still. For a brief moment, it seemed that the reflection smiled before he did, as if it had a life of its own. He looked closer, searching for something familiar but found only distance. It occurred to him then that power, at its core, is a mirror. It shows not who you are, but what others fear you to be. The more he stared, the more he realized that he no longer knew which version of himself the world believed in and which one he had become. Outside, Harlem pulsed with the energy of his empire, but inside, he felt hollow. The money continued to flow, the operations ran flawlessly, and yet everything around him seemed fragile, unreal. The more perfect his system became, the less alive it felt. He began to understand what Bumpy had meant when he said that control is both a crown and a chain. He had achieved everything he set out to, and in doing so, had imprisoned himself in the image of perfection. There was no room for error, no space for rest, no human softness left in the machinery of his existence. Late one night, unable to sleep, he walked again to the hallway of mirrors. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of a clock somewhere far away. He stood before his reflection, his face half lit by the glow of a single lamp. For a long moment, he studied the lines on his forehead, the stillness of his mouth, the eyes that had seen too much and felt too little. Then, almost without realizing it, he lifted his hand and struck the glass. The sound was sharp but oddly satisfying. A web of cracks spread outward from the point of impact, splintering his image into fragments that caught the light like shattered truth. He stood there, breathing evenly, watching his reflection dissolve into pieces. The fractured images overlapped. Young and old, powerful and tired, conqueror and prisoner, all of them versions of the same man. The silence that followed was deep and complete. He turned away, leaving the shards to catch the faint glow of morning that was beginning to rise beyond the window. And somewhere outside, as dawn broke over Harlem, a car engine started, a door opened, and a new day began with the same quiet inevitability that always followed destruction. The morning after he shattered the mirror, the light came through the windows in a softer hue than usual, as though the world had decided to move with hesitation. Harlem was stirring beneath him, its streets alive with the same noise that had once thrilled him, but now sounded faintly discordant, like a record spinning slightly off its groove. Frank dressed as he always did, his suit pressed, his tie neatly folded into its knot, his shoes gleaming. Ritual was his refuge. Each motion was a thread that held together the illusion of control. Yet beneath the surface of his calm gestures, something restless had begun to stir. The cracks he had seen in the glass seemed to have extended into the fabric of his empire. Conversation shifted when he entered the room. Reports that used to reach him effortlessly now came delayed. The silence that had once been his ally had begun to sound suspicious. The law had started to move, not with the blunt aggression of a raid, but with the patience of an animal stalking its prey. There were rumors of a task force, men who did not take bribes, who did not play by the old rules of compromise. At the center of it was a name he began to hear more often, whispered by men who knew the value of caution: Richie Roberts. The stories about him were almost absurd in their rarity. An honest cop, they said, one who had turned in $1 million in unmarked bills found in a car trunk. Frank respected that kind of integrity in theory, but he also understood the danger of a man who could not be bought. Bribery was the oil that kept the machine of the city running. Without it, friction turned into fire. At first, Frank underestimated him. Harlem had been hunted before. The police had always come in waves, crashing hard, making noise, then fading back into bureaucracy. But Roberts was different. He did not chase chaos. He dissected it. He was patient, deliberate, methodical. He studied patterns, not rumors. He gathered evidence piece by piece, tracing shipments through warehouses, accounts through banks, movements through whispers. While others looked for spectacle, he looked for structure. And Frank's empire, so elegantly built, was full of structure. Meanwhile, Frank's family grew more restless. The wealth that had once united them was now becoming a source of suspicion. The smallest mistake could draw attention, and attention was fatal. Yet his brothers could not resist the allure of visibility. They threw parties, flashed cars, dressed in furs that gleamed under the camera flashes of the same press Frank had paid to ignore him. He warned them gently at first, then firmly. "We don't show our hand," he told them, voice level, eyes steady. But the caution that once defined him had not passed to them. They were living in the glow of an empire whose shadow they did not feel. In the newspapers, the words began to appear. Unprecedented heroin purity, new supplier, mystery source. The name Blue Magic became both a promise and a curse. It was spoken in songs, on street corners, in whispered confessions at church pews. The brand was too powerful, too consistent, too visible. It was no longer a secret. Visibility, the one thing Frank had spent his life avoiding, had found him at last. He could feel the shift happening like weather. Subtle, inevitable, unstoppable. Harlem still bowed to him, but it no longer looked at him the same way. Respect had begun to curdle into superstition. People crossed the street when they saw his car, unsure whether to fear his power or his fall. Roberts, meanwhile, was tightening the net. He saw the pattern others missed. The source of the drug was too clean, too well organized to be a street operation. He suspected the military shipments from Asia, but lacked the evidence to prove it. For months he watched, listened, followed. He began to trace Frank's relatives, those who handled logistics without understanding the depth of their own exposure. The web was too perfect, and perfect things always betray themselves. Frank knew that, though he told no one. He began to change his habits: shorter meetings, fewer calls, a smaller circle of trust. The walls of his mansion felt closer now, not like safety, but confinement. The house that had once echoed with the laughter of family now carried the quiet tension of a bunker. One night, unable to sleep, Frank drove through Harlem alone. The streets were slick from rain, the reflections of neon lights sliding across puddles like ghosts. He rolled down the window, breathing in the damp air. The city was quieter now, the energy subdued, as if waiting for something to break. He drove past the corners he had once controlled, past the bars that had once welcomed him with reverence. The faces were different, younger, hungrier, less disciplined. He could see the difference in their eyes, the recklessness that comes when fear of consequence fades. His empire had created them, but he no longer recognized them. At a stoplight, he caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. The rain traced thin lines across the glass, cutting his face into fragments again. For a moment, he imagined he was watching someone else, a man who had reached too far and begun to fall back toward the earth. He thought of Bumpy Johnson's words, the warning buried in their calm wisdom. You can't hold the streets forever. He had dismissed it then, believing control could outlast chaos. Now he understood that the streets do not belong to anyone. They simply rent themselves out to whoever has the will to pay in blood, fear, and time. Back home, the phone rang just before dawn. The voice on the other end was nervous, speaking too quickly. There had been a raid, one of their storage houses. The police had come with warrants, dogs, and cameras. The product was gone, the men arrested. Frank listened without interruption, his voice calm when he finally spoke. "Don't say another word on the phone," he said, then hung up. He stood in the stillness for a long moment, his eyes on the floor, the sound of the refrigerator hum filling the space between thought and reaction. The first domino had fallen. He went to the window and drew the curtain slightly aside. The morning light was faint, hesitant. Outside, the street was still, the world seemingly unchanged, but he could feel it now, the shift, the pull of gravity that no man escapes. Every empire, he thought, falls not when it is attacked, but when it begins to believe in its own invincibility. For years he had been invisible, disciplined, untouchable. Now his face was reflected everywhere, in mirrors, in puddles, in the cautious glances of those who once served him. The invisible king had stepped into the light, and the light was merciless. He turned away from the window, poured himself a drink, and sat at the table, his hands steady. There was no panic in him, only awareness. The game had changed again, and he would need to play differently. Yet deep inside, he felt something he had not felt in decades, a sense of inevitability, like the first quiet notes of a song he already knew the ending to. The clock ticked steadily in the background, marking time with the precision he once thought he controlled, and somewhere beyond the silence, a siren wailed, faint but approaching, its sound winding through the streets like a prophecy. The siren faded into the morning as if swallowed by the city, leaving behind a silence that was somehow heavier than sound. Frank sat still, his hands folded on the table, his thoughts moving faster than his pulse. He had always believed that betrayal arrived with warning, that it revealed itself through whispers, glances, or hesitation. But now he understood that betrayal was often quiet, patient, and sometimes unintentional, a simple alignment of fear and self-preservation. He had built his empire on the illusion of loyalty, binding his men through family, trust, and discipline. Yet now, as the investigation deepened and pressure mounted, he could feel the threads loosening. Men who had once sworn blood oaths began to falter under interrogation, their confidence eroded by promises of safety whispered from across steel tables. The very order that had protected him was beginning to invert, turning its precision against him. The first true betrayal came not from a rival, but from within his own circle. One of his cousins, arrested during a raid, spoke more than he should have. It was not treachery born of greed, but weakness born of fear. The law had ways of breaking men that violence never could: fatigue, silence, the slow unraveling of certainty. They offered deals, small comforts, words that sounded like mercy. And mercy, Frank knew, was a dangerous language to a man who had never been shown any. When word reached him that one of his own had confessed to names, to routes, to connections, Frank said nothing. He dismissed his men from the room, poured himself a drink, and stared at the amber liquid as though it could tell him what to do. He did not rage, did not curse, did not strike out. Anger was for men without control. He simply sat there, the quiet of the room pressing in like a confession he had not yet made to himself. Later that night, he drove alone to the outskirts of the city, where the skyline faded into low warehouses, and the wind carried the faint smell of the river. The air was cold, sharp, cleansing. He parked beneath a flickering streetlight and stepped out, his shoes crunching softly against gravel. It was here, in places like this, that so much of his life had been decided, in silence, under cover of night, between choices that all led to loss. He thought of Bumpy again, the way the old man had looked when they first met, composed, unyielding, and already tired. He wondered if this was how all kings ended, not with rebellion but with erosion, not with a shot but with a whisper. Back in Harlem, paranoia had become its own kind of currency. The men who had once been brothers now eyed one another with suspicion. Every conversation carried double meanings. Every meeting stretched longer than it should. Frank, who had once been the calm center of a perfect storm, now found himself surrounded by uncertainty. He began to test those closest to him. Subtle traps of information, small lies planted to see who would carry them outward. Each time a rumor returned to him, twisted, he marked another name in his mind, another bridge quietly burning. Yet what unsettled him most was not their betrayal, but his own lack of surprise. He had foreseen it all, even prepared for it, but the foreknowledge brought no comfort. If anything, it revealed how far he had drifted from the very thing that had once defined him: trust. His mother noticed the change in him, though she never spoke of it directly. Her presence, once a source of calm, had become a quiet reminder of everything he had endangered. She would sit in her chair by the window, watching him as he moved through the house, her eyes following him with a sadness he could not meet. One evening, she broke her silence. "You look tired, Frankie," she said softly, her voice thin but steady. "You can't fight the whole world forever." He smiled faintly, the way one smiles when a truth is spoken too simply to be believed. "I'm not fighting," he said. "I'm holding it together." But even as he said the words, he felt their emptiness. The world did not need to fight him. It only needed to wait. Juliana had grown distant, her affection replaced by caution. She saw the signs of collapse before he would admit them. The late-night phone calls, the sudden silences, the guarded expressions of men who came to the house with worry in their eyes. She asked questions he would not answer, and in his refusal, she began to understand. The life they had built, the mansion that had once felt like refuge, was becoming a gilded cage. One night, after a dinner where conversation failed to bridge the distance between them, she said, "You don't see what's happening, Frank. Everyone around you is afraid, even me." He looked at her, the calm mask unbroken, and replied, "Fear keeps people honest." But as soon as the words left his mouth, he wished he had not said them. Fear does not keep people honest. It only keeps them quiet until they can escape. He started to hear new names in the streets, new faces rising from the cracks left by his empire's slow decay. The order he had created had begun to splinter into smaller empires, each less disciplined, each more violent. It was as if the city were reclaiming what it had once lent him, dissolving the myth he had built. The discipline that had made him strong was now mocked as old-fashioned, the quiet efficiency replaced by recklessness. Frank watched from a distance, unable to intervene without revealing himself. His invisibility, once his greatest strength, had become isolation. Meanwhile, Richie Roberts continued to close the gap. Each confession led to another clue, each arrest another piece of the puzzle. The task force moved with the slow certainty of truth, indifferent to intimidation or bribery. They were not chasing a man. They were dismantling an idea. Roberts understood what others did not, that Frank's empire was not sustained by violence, but by trust and silence. Destroy the silence, and the rest would follow. The investigation reached deeper, across oceans, through banks, into the hidden arteries of commerce that connected Harlem to Asia. Frank could feel their presence now, invisible but constant, like a breath on the back of his neck. The betrayals multiplied. Friends vanished. Some fled the city. Others turned themselves in, hoping for leniency. Every phone call became a risk, every conversation a potential confession. He began to keep fewer people around, retreating into solitude. The mansion grew quieter, its rooms echoing with absence. The laughter that once filled the halls had long since disappeared. He found himself spending hours alone in his study, surrounded by ledgers that no longer comforted him. The numbers had lost their meaning. The empire they represented had become a hollow monument to a version of himself he no longer recognized. One night, after receiving news of another arrest, another cousin, another name given away under pressure, he poured a drink and sat by the window. The city stretched before him, glowing faintly under the haze of light and smoke. It looked beautiful from a distance, orderly even, but he knew what lay beneath: the hunger, the fear, the decay. He had built something vast and disciplined, yet in the end, it was as mortal as any man. He thought again of that boy in North Carolina, standing barefoot in the red dirt, promising himself never to be powerless. Now he wondered whether power had been just another kind of prison, one that disguised itself as freedom. Outside, a car door slammed somewhere in the distance, sharp against the night air. He looked toward the sound but saw nothing. For a long moment he remained there, listening, the faint taste of bitterness on his tongue. Betrayal, he thought, was not a moment but a process, the slow surrender of belief. And somewhere within that thought, he realized that the process was nearly complete. He turned off the light, leaving the house in darkness, and for the first time in years, allowed himself to feel what he had spent his life avoiding: the weight of being alone. The night he was taken, the air was clear and cold, the kind of cold that sharpens sound and slows movement. The city had gone to sleep, but the machinery of law had not. The task force moved through the streets with quiet precision, unmarked cars gliding into position, lights off, radios low. Frank had been awake for hours, sitting in his study, a single lamp burning beside him. The papers on his desk were neatly stacked, ledgers, phone numbers, notes written in his careful hand, but he was no longer reading them. The house felt too still, the silence too deliberate. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then stopped. He had learned long ago that silence, like calm water, often preceded disturbance. He stood and adjusted his tie, not out of vanity but ritual, then turned off the lamp. When the knock came, it was not a knock of hesitation. The door splintered open under the weight of purpose, and the sound of boots filled the hall. He did not run. He never imagined he would. The officers entered shouting, the command of dominance that is meant to unsettle. But Frank did not flinch. He raised his hands slowly, his expression unreadable, his voice calm. "I'm right here," he said, as though acknowledging an appointment rather than surrendering to it. The handcuffs were cold against his wrists, the metal biting just enough to remind him of what was real. As they led him outside, the night seemed strangely bright. Floodlights bathed the lawn, their harsh glare revealing the faces of men who had hunted him for years. Cameras flashed, voices shouted questions. He did not answer any of them. His eyes moved over the scene once, taking it in. The cars, the agents, the silhouettes of neighbors watching from behind curtains. And then he looked away. At the station, the air smelled of disinfectant and fatigue. The room was bare except for a metal table and 2 chairs. He was left there for hours, the kind of waiting designed to wear a man down. But Frank had lived most of his life inside silences. He was comfortable there. He leaned back, his cuffs resting loosely against the table's edge, his gaze steady. When Richie Roberts finally entered, the room seemed to shift slightly, not from fear, but recognition. 2 men, both disciplined, both shaped by systems they had learned to manipulate in opposite ways. Roberts sat down, set his file on the table, and studied Frank for a moment before speaking. "You've built something extraordinary," he said quietly, "but you know it can't last." Frank smiled faintly. "Nothing does," he replied. The conversation that followed was not a battle of wits, but of philosophies. Roberts spoke of law, of responsibility, of the damage wrought by greed and addiction. Frank listened, his face impassive, and then answered in the calm rhythm of a man who had already accepted his place in the story. "You think I'm the problem," he said, "but I didn't make this world. I just learned how it works." There was no arrogance in his tone, only weariness. Roberts regarded him with something close to curiosity. They were 2 sides of the same coin, one devoted to order through rules, the other to order through control. Both men believed in discipline, both despised waste, both understood that power, in the end, was just another kind of belief. The interrogation stretched into morning, but Frank revealed little. The truth, he knew, was no longer his to protect. It had already been mapped by the evidence. The raids had uncovered warehouses, bank accounts, documents, testimonies. The architecture of his empire was laid bare. The newspapers would call it the most sophisticated drug network in American history. But Frank did not care for history's approval. He was thinking of his mother, who would wake soon to the news, and of Juliana, who had seen this moment coming long before he did. He wondered if she would cry, or if her tears had already run dry from years of quiet dread. In the holding cell, time lost its meaning. The walls were the same dull gray as every other cell he had ever passed in his rise from the streets. But this one felt different. It did not hum with fear or rage. It hummed with the sound of an ending. He lay on the narrow cot, staring at the ceiling, his mind drifting in between memories. The first train north, the first handshake with Bumpy, the first bundle of money thick enough to make his hands shake. He thought of his mother humming in the kitchen, of his brothers laughing before ambition turned them inward, of Harlem glittering in the rain. Each image flickered like film against his closed eyelids, a story projected on the inside of his mind. He did not sleep. He did not need to. Sleep was for men who believed in tomorrow. Days turned to weeks. The trial loomed, inevitable. Reporters filled the courtroom, their pens ready, their eyes hungry. The prosecutor spoke of poison, of greed, of a man who had corrupted a generation. Frank sat in silence, his posture impeccable, his gaze fixed on nothing. When the verdict came, it was neither shock nor relief. It was simply another form of order. The sentence was long enough to erase decades. He nodded once when the judge finished reading, then stood as the guards approached. For the first time in years, there was no decision left to make. Prison was not new to him, but this time it felt different. He entered its gates not as an errand boy or soldier, but as a king stripped of his throne. The world outside shrank to rumor and radio. His days became simple: wake, eat, work, sleep. Yet in the monotony, there was a strange peace. The rules were clear, the consequences predictable. He did not have to hide, to plan, to calculate. The discipline that had once served his empire now served his survival. He read constantly, history, philosophy, newspapers, months out of date. He began to think not of the empire he had lost, but of the man he had been before it. Sometimes, while walking the narrow yard under a gray sky, he would catch the scent of rain on concrete and feel the faintest echo of freedom. It was not the kind of freedom he had chased all his life, the freedom of control, of dominance, but something quieter, emptier, purer. He wondered if this was what peace felt like, the absence of ambition, the surrender of illusion. Yet even then he could not entirely let go. The instinct to command, to calculate, lingered like a pulse beneath the calm. Power, once tasted, never truly leaves the bloodstream. He received letters from his mother until her hands grew too weak to write, and from his wife until her hope turned to silence. The world outside continued to move, forgetting him slowly, replacing his name with new legends, new kings, new myths. He read about Harlem's decay, about the city's transformation, about wars that ended and new ones that began. Each headline reminded him how temporary all empires were. He began to find a strange comfort in that thought. Years later, when he would look back on this time, he would say that prison did not break him. It revealed him. It stripped away everything unnecessary, leaving only the man he had always been, disciplined, deliberate, and alone. He no longer thought of redemption or ruin. He thought only of stillness, of the quiet space between one breath and the next. And as he lay on his cot one night, the lights dimmed and the world outside forgotten, he heard a faint sound, the distant echo of a train whistle, carried through memory more than air. It reminded him of another beginning, another escape. But this time, there was nowhere left to go. The train's echo faded into the hum of the prison, the steady rhythm of keys and footsteps that marked the slow passage of time. The days had begun to blur together, meals served at the same hour, the same gray yard, the same men walking the same circles under the watch of guards who had long since stopped looking at them as individuals. For most, this sameness was death by degrees, but for Frank, it became a form of meditation. He had always lived in structure, had always found meaning in routine. Now stripped of his empire, he saw that structure from the other side, how it could comfort and confine in equal measure. He had spent his life building a machine to control others. Now he was inside one, anonymous and powerless. Weeks became months, and word of his cooperation began to spread quietly through the prison. It started with a single meeting. Richie Roberts came to see him again, not as hunter and hunted, but as two men bound by circumstance. The law had taken from Frank what it needed, but it also knew he held knowledge too valuable to ignore. The room they met in was small and bare, its walls humming faintly with the buzz of fluorescent lights. Roberts sat across from him, a folder in his hand, his expression unreadable. "You know the system better than anyone," he said. "Help us dismantle it." Frank studied him for a long moment, his eyes calm, his face betraying nothing. He knew what was being asked of him. Not cooperation, but confession. Not redemption, but usefulness. At first, he refused. The code he had lived by, the one Bumpy had taught him, still held weight. Loyalty, even to the fallen, was a kind of faith. But as the days stretched into months, as faces he once knew vanished into indictments and new names filled the papers, he began to wonder what loyalty meant when the world you had sworn it to no longer existed. The men he had protected were gone, many of them already talking to save themselves. His brothers, his partners, his allies, each had traded pieces of the empire for survival. And survival, Frank knew better than anyone, was the only true law. When Roberts returned, Frank simply said, "Tell me what you need to know." What followed was not an act of betrayal, but of exhaustion. He spoke clearly, factually, without embellishment or remorse. He described routes, names, accounts, operations, the invisible architecture of a criminal world built on trust and silence. The agents listened, their pens moving across paper, their faces masks of focus. Frank did not seek sympathy, nor did he offer justification. He understood that his cooperation would not erase his past, only repurpose it. What the law called betrayal, he saw as pragmatism. Power had changed hands, and he was adapting to its new form. Outside, his testimony sent tremors through the underworld. Men who had once spoken his name with reverence now cursed it in secrecy. To them, he was a traitor, a man who had traded honor for comfort. But honor was a luxury he no longer believed in. In his mind, the rules had changed the moment the empire fell. There was no loyalty left to protect, no legacy left to preserve. The game was over, and he was simply helping write its ending. Yet even as he spoke the words that dismantled what he had built, part of him felt detached, as if watching from a distance. He was no longer Frank Lucas the kingpin, nor even Frank Lucas the prisoner. He had become something else entirely, an observer of his own undoing. Roberts, for his part, approached him with a quiet professionalism that Frank respected. There was no gloating, no moral superiority. In their strange, restrained way, they understood one another. Both men had built their lives around control, one through law, the other through crime, and both had discovered the futility of that control. During one of their final meetings, Roberts asked him, "Do you ever think about what you could have done differently?" Frank looked at him, a faint smile touching his lips. "Every day," he said, "but thinking doesn't change what's already been lived." The simplicity of the answer seemed to hang in the air, neither defiant nor repentant, just true. Months later, after the investigations ended and the trials concluded, Frank was transferred to another facility. His cooperation had earned him a measure of leniency, but freedom was still a distant concept. The days resumed their rhythm, and in that rhythm, he found a strange comfort. He began to teach others, young inmates drawn to the mythology of power that had once defined him. He warned them not with lectures, but with stories, told quietly in the yard, without judgment. "The streets don't love you," he would say. "They use you until you forget who you are." Some listened, most didn't. He didn't blame them. He understood that every man must learn through his own ruin. At night, when the prison lights dimmed and the world outside dissolved into silence, he thought of Harlem, not the Harlem of money and power, but the Harlem of his youth, when music spilled from open windows and the air carried the scent of fried food and sweat and possibility. He remembered walking those streets as a young man, eyes wide, ambition burning like fever. Somewhere along the way, that ambition had turned into something else, something harder, colder, heavier. Now, in the stillness of confinement, he felt its weight lifting, grain by grain, as if the years themselves were peeling away his armor. There were moments when he allowed himself to imagine a future beyond the walls. He pictured his mother's porch, long since empty, the creak of the rocking chair, the sound of cicadas rising in the summer night. He knew he could never return there, not really, but the thought carried a peace he had never known during his years of power. Freedom, he realized, was not a place but a quiet acceptance of what could no longer be controlled. It was not about escape, but surrender. When the day finally came that his sentence was shortened, it felt less like triumph and more like conclusion. The guards led him through the same gates that had once swallowed him, their faces indifferent. The world beyond was brighter than he remembered, the light almost painful. The air smelled of gasoline and rain. He stood there for a moment, eyes closed, the sound of traffic rushing around him, the noise of life indifferent to his return. He had expected relief, perhaps even joy, but what he felt was something deeper, emptiness that bordered on peace. The system had used him as he had once used others. Justice, he understood now, was not purity but equilibrium. It did not heal, it balanced. He had given the law what it demanded, and in return, it had given him time to sit in silence, to think, to feel the slow rhythm of remorse without self-pity. In that balance, he found something that resembled forgiveness, not from the world, but from himself. That night, in the small room where he spent his first evening outside, he poured himself a glass of water and watched the moonlight move across the floor. The sound of the city drifted in through the open window. Sirens, laughter, footsteps. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. The world had continued without him, as it always would. And for the first time, he felt no need to catch up. Freedom arrived like a ghost, too quiet to be trusted, too gentle to believe in. When the gates closed behind him for the last time, Frank Lucas stepped into a world that no longer remembered him. The city had changed its skin, its rhythm, its faces. The Harlem he had once ruled was now a faded echo, its streets renamed, its corners sterilized by a new order that had no memory of the men who once controlled them. The buildings stood the same but hollowed, the music had shifted, and even the air seemed thinner, less charged with the electricity of danger and possibility that had once been its pulse. Frank walked slowly through it all, an observer in his own afterlife. No one recognized him. The anonymity, which once would have been a weapon, now felt like an exile. He lived simply, quietly, in a small apartment that looked out over a narrow street. The mornings were his own now. He would rise early, as he always had, out of habit rather than purpose. He made coffee, read the paper, though he rarely finished it. The headlines were full of names he didn't know. New wars, new politicians, new criminals. He had once believed that history was made by men of will, by those who shaped it with their ambition. Now he saw that history moved on its own, with or without witnesses. He was no longer part of its current, merely something the tide had deposited on the shore. There were days when he ventured out, walking without direction, moving through neighborhoods that had long since stopped belonging to him. The old clubs were gone, replaced by storefront churches and laundromats. The faces of Harlem had shifted, new generations, new languages, new hungers. Sometimes he would pass a group of young men talking on a corner, their gestures echoing the same bravado he once admired in himself. They reminded him of ghosts repeating a pattern they didn't understand. He wanted to warn them, to tell them how easily power turns to dust, but he never spoke. Advice from a forgotten man was just another kind of noise. At night, the silence pressed close. He had no entourage, no bodyguards, no calls demanding his attention. The stillness, at first unbearable, began to feel like penance. In prison, he had longed for silence. Now it seemed to stretch too far, a void filled only by memory. He would sit by the window, the city lights flickering against the glass, and think of the sounds that used to define him. The roar of engines, the snap of cash, the murmur of men waiting for his command. Those sounds were gone, replaced by the low hum of traffic, the distant bark of dogs, the soft drip of a faucet in the next room. The world no longer asked anything of him, and in that absence of demand, he found something close to clarity. The years inside had stripped him of urgency. He had learned to live within the narrow confines of routine, and that discipline followed him into this new life. He cleaned his apartment meticulously, folded his clothes with precision, kept his shoes lined in order by the door. It was not pride, but structure that comforted him, the small rituals that kept the mind anchored. He cooked simple meals, often more than he could eat, as though cooking were a way to fill the space that conversation used to occupy. Occasionally, a neighbor would greet him, an old woman who mistook his politeness for shyness. To her, he was just another aging man with quiet manners and a watchful gaze. He liked it that way. But the past does not dissolve. It lingers like smoke that seeps into everything, invisible yet unmistakable. There were nights when dreams visited him, fragments of faces, voices, moments blurred by time. He saw Bumpy Johnson again sitting at the chessboard, his hand hovering over a piece that never moved. He saw his mother, younger, standing by the window of their home in North Carolina, calling him in from the fields. He saw his brothers laughing, their eyes still bright before fear and greed dimmed them. He woke from these dreams without sadness, only with the hollow ache of remembrance. The dead, he thought, live most vividly in silence. One afternoon he took the train to visit the grave of his mother. The cemetery was quiet, the winter air sharp and clean. He stood before the headstone for a long time, his hands folded, his breath visible in the cold. There were no words to say, nothing that could balance what had been done or left undone. He had built an empire for her comfort, and in doing so had buried himself in the ruins of its logic. He realized now that she had never asked for power, only peace. It was a simple truth, and simplicity had always been the one thing he had avoided. He knelt, brushed a leaf from the stone, and whispered, "I made it out, Ma." The wind rose slightly, rustling through the trees, and he thought for a moment that she had heard. As the years wore on, visitors came occasionally. Journalists, filmmakers, curious minds drawn by the myth rather than the man. They wanted stories, confessions, insight into the machinery of his rise and fall. Frank received them politely, speaking softly, never exaggerating, never apologizing. His tone was measured, his words factual. He did not glamorize his past nor seek redemption from it. "People love stories about kings," he once told a young interviewer, "but they forget that kings are just men who ran out of places to hide." The line made its way into articles, quoted as wisdom, but to Frank it was simply the truth. He had lived long enough to watch himself become a legend, then an example, then a cautionary tale. The movies would come later, the interviews, the renewed fascination with the mythology of crime. He was flattered in a detached way, but he understood how myths work. They turn flesh into fiction. The Frank Lucas of the world's imagination was not him, but a composite of fear, envy, and awe. The real man was smaller, quieter, worn thin by the weight of remembering. Sometimes, when the city grew too loud, he would take the bus to the edge of the Hudson, where the air smelled faintly of salt and rust. He would sit on a bench and watch the water move, slow and endless, carrying fragments of light across its surface. There was something soothing in its persistence, the way it reflected everything without holding it. He thought that perhaps this was what life was meant to be, a series of reflections passing over the surface of time, leaving no mark but their own disappearance. In those long hours by the river, he began to understand regret, not as pain, but as gravity, something that kept him tethered to what was real. He had spent decades running from it, mistaking motion for freedom. Now stillness had become his teacher. There was no absolution waiting for him, no forgiveness to seek. There was only the quiet acceptance that all things, even power, fade into silence. One evening, As dusk settled and the city lights began to shimmer on the water, Frank closed his eyes and listened. The world was still moving, trains rumbling in the distance, sirens echoing faintly, voices blending into a soft, endless murmur. It sounded, to him, like breathing. For the first time in his life, he felt no need to measure it, to master it, to control its rhythm. The silence between sounds was enough. When Frank finally began to step back into the world, it was not out of desire, but necessity. Freedom, he had come to realize, was not an event, but a slow negotiation with time. He could not live forever in silence, though part of him wished he could. The city outside had become a stranger, humming with a rhythm that no longer recognized his name. He had been both architect and prisoner of Harlem's myth, and now that myth had been repaved into new streets, new lives, new ambitions that bore no trace of the empire he had once ruled. The towers were higher, the lights brighter, the noise constant. He walked through it cautiously, as though through a city built on memory rather than brick. His reflection followed him in every window, a faint outline of someone who used to be important. But importance, he now knew, was a temporary illusion, a mirage that faded as soon as one stopped chasing it. He tried, in small ways, to rebuild a life that felt real. He volunteered at a community center, helping young men who came from the same hunger he once knew, the same hunger that had shaped his youth into ambition and his ambition into crime. They didn't always recognize him, at least not immediately, though a few had seen the movie that turned his story into spectacle. They spoke to him with the respectful curiosity reserved for ghosts. "You really used to run all that?" one asked, his voice half admiration, half disbelief. Frank only smiled faintly. "I ran myself," he said. "The rest followed." It was the closest he could come to honesty. He did not tell them about the fear that powered every decision, about the loneliness that comes when everyone obeys, but no one truly sees you. These were not lessons he could give. They were truths that had to be lived to be believed. Sometimes, after the meetings ended, he would walk home through the same streets where his name had once meant power. The air was different now, cleaner, quieter, almost polite. The corners where he used to station men now held coffee shops, boutiques, daycare centers. The city had learned to disguise its hunger with civility. The dealers still existed, but they were younger, slicker, less romantic. He watched them from a distance, a faint ache in his chest. The trade had evolved, but the motive had not. Poverty still taught the same language, and ambition still offered the same false promise of escape. Harlem had changed its clothes, but not its bones. The people who remembered him were mostly gone, some dead, some scattered, some changed beyond recognition. Occasionally, an old face would appear, a former associate, older, slower, moving with the same cautious grace of survival. They would exchange brief greetings, eyes meeting for a moment before looking away. There was no anger between them, only understanding. They were relics of the same past, bound not by friendship but by history. It was a peculiar kind of intimacy, one that did not require words. They had all outlived the version of themselves that had once mattered, and in that survival there was both tragedy and peace. Juliana had moved on long before his release. He heard she lived quietly, somewhere far from the noise of the city, raising their children with a dignity he had not earned. He did not blame her. Love, he had learned, was not an oath, but a fragile truce between two people who believe they can hold each other's chaos. He had broken that truce long ago. Sometimes he would imagine her sitting by a window, reading, the same way she used to in their early years, the soft glow of the lamp outlining her face. He hoped she had found peace. He never tried to find her. Some things, he thought, should remain untouchable once lost. The invitations came occasionally. Universities, television networks, journalists asking for his perspective, his story, his lessons. He declined most of them. The idea of retelling his life for profit seemed absurd now, like selling tickets to a house that had already burned down. But once, after much persuasion, he agreed to speak at a youth outreach event in Newark. The gym was packed, the air heavy with curiosity. He stood at the podium, looking out at rows of faces that mirrored the same mixture of innocence and defiance he once carried. "They'll tell you, money will make you free," he began, his voice low, steady. "They'll tell you power means respect. But freedom isn't about having, it's about being able to walk away from what owns you." The room was silent. For the first time in years, he felt his words land somewhere beyond himself. Still, the nights remained long. He often returned home exhausted not from activity but from memory. His apartment, small and clean, felt like an island floating in time. He kept few possessions, just the essentials, a few books, a photograph of his mother that had yellowed at the edges. He cooked dinner alone, sometimes listening to old jazz records, the needle crackling as though time itself were speaking through static. The music carried him back to smoky rooms and whispered deals, to a Harlem that breathed in rhythm and exhaled in sin. Yet the nostalgia never became longing. It was memory stripped of desire, the past seen through the soft filter of distance. There were days when he visited the old neighborhood, sitting on a bench near 116th Street, watching the flow of people. Children laughed where hustlers once stood. Old women carried groceries past walls now painted with murals of faces from other eras. A few men nodded to him, perhaps out of recognition, or perhaps just respect for an elder who watched without judgment. He never corrected their assumptions. To them, he was a quiet figure from another time, a man who had seen too much and lived to tell none of it. That anonymity suited him. It was the first kind of peace that did not feel borrowed. Yet even in peace, guilt never vanished. It only softened into reflection. Sometimes, in the gray light of dawn, he would wake before the city stirred and feel the weight of it pressing against him. The families broken by addiction, the children who grew up fatherless, the echo of lives altered by the choices he had made. He did not justify them anymore, nor did he seek forgiveness. He understood now that remorse was not a transaction. It was a landscape one learned to live within, vast and unending, marked by silence instead of absolution. He carried it like weather, invisible but constant. Years slipped by quietly. His hair thinned, his walk slowed, but his mind remained clear. The past no longer hunted him. It simply accompanied him, like an old companion who knew when to stay silent. He began to notice the small beauties he had once ignored. The sound of rain on the window, the way sunlight fractured through glass, the warmth of a stranger's smile offered without motive. Life, stripped of ambition, had become something delicate and precise, like breath. He did not seek meaning in it anymore. Meaning, he understood, had always been an invention of the restless. Now, rest itself was enough. One evening, as the sun sank behind the skyline, painting the city in gold and rust, Frank lingered on his balcony, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand. The light touched the building softly, the way memory touches loss. He thought about how far he had traveled, from red dirt to marble floors, from prison walls to this quiet view, and how none of it had really been distance at all, only circles drawn by the same human need to matter. He smiled faintly, almost amused by the symmetry of it. The empire, the downfall, the silence, all of it felt like one long exhale after a lifetime of holding his breath. Below him, the city carried on, indifferent and eternal. The laughter of children rose faintly from the street, blending with the hum of traffic and the soft murmur of wind. It was the sound of life continuing, unburdened by memory. Frank listened to it as the last of the light faded, his thoughts as calm as the evening itself. The world no longer owed him anything, and for the first time, he felt the freedom he had spent a lifetime chasing. quiet, simple, and real? The evening light faded into night, and Harlem breathed with the soft pulse of a city settling into itself. Frank sat in the dim glow of his living room, the television murmuring faintly in the background. It was a documentary, one of those true crime retrospectives that turned the past into a spectacle. His name surfaced midway through the narration, spoken with the detached precision of a voice trained to entertain rather than understand. Images flashed across the screen. Grainy photographs of money stacked in suitcases, cars gleaming under police floodlights, headlines screaming about corruption and greed. Then came the face of Denzel Washington, playing him in a film that had turned his story into legend. The voiceover spoke of him as both visionary and villain, a paradox in flesh. Frank watched in silence, the reflection of the screen flickering in his eyes. He did not flinch, did not smile. He had expected, after all these years, that the world would remake him into whatever shape it needed. The movie had been both a blessing and a distortion. It had brought him back into the public imagination, had made him relevant again for a brief moment, but the version of Frank Lucas it celebrated was a shadow, polished, dramatic, simplified. He understood why it had to be that way. Stories demanded edges sharper than truth. Yet as he watched the actor move with that same measured calm he once possessed, he felt something like recognition mixed with distance, as though he were looking at a brother who had taken his life and lived it differently. The scenes of violence, the cold efficiency, the grandeur, all of it true in fragments, false in totality. What the camera could not capture was the silence, the fatigue, the slow erosion that followed power's glow. He wondered if the audience clapping in dark theaters ever thought about what happened after the credits rolled. The calls came again after the film's release. Journalists, producers, students writing dissertations on morality and capitalism. They wanted insight, sound bites, redemption. Some wanted him to condemn his past, others wanted him to defend it. He answered few of them. He had learned that people didn't come to hear the truth. They came to hear their version of it confirmed. He spoke softly when he did speak, his voice low, deliberate, and empty of spectacle. "I did what I did," he would say. "The world paid me for it. Then it paid to watch me fall." The reporters always wrote that down, thinking it profound, but for Frank, it was just arithmetic. Every man, he thought, sells something. He had merely sold what the world was already buying. The attention, brief and burning, faded as quickly as it had come. Fame, like infamy, had a short memory. Harlem went on reinventing itself. The city forgot, as cities must. But the myth lingered, a ghost of an empire that once ruled the streets. He would sometimes hear younger men speaking his name, their voices full of awe and envy. They admired the discipline, the success, the defiance of a system that had never been built for men like him. They saw a story of victory where he saw only the long shadow of loss. Once, sitting outside a diner, he overheard two young dealers arguing about who was more legendary, him or some new name he'd never heard. One of them said, "Lucas did it clean, man. He was smart. He was the boss." Frank turned his gaze toward the window, seeing his reflection in the glass, an old man with gray hair and steady eyes. The thought that someone still saw him as powerful felt almost absurd. He wanted to tell them that power is just another kind of hunger, one that devours the man who feeds it. But he stayed quiet. The myth would teach them what he could not. At times, he found himself studying his own image on television or in the papers, not out of vanity but curiosity. The face that stared back had become a symbol, stripped of context and contradiction. He thought about how the world likes its sinners, clean and its saints dirty, how complexity unsettles people more than evil ever could. He had never claimed to be good or bad. He had simply been efficient. And yet, in the end, it was efficiency that damned him. because the world does not forgive precision when it exposes its own hypocrisy. Watching himself become legend was like watching a portrait painted by strangers, each stroke both flattering and wrong. He realized that once your story leaves your hands, it no longer belongs to you. It belongs to the imagination of others, and imagination is a kind of burial. There were moments when he laughed at the absurdity of it all. He would read a headline calling him Harlem's genius of crime and think of how much of his empire had been luck, instinct, or coincidence. The myth turned every decision into foresight, every mistake into cunning. The reality was far less poetic. He had stumbled often, doubted constantly, and acted out of fear more than vision. But people preferred stories of control, not vulnerability. They wanted kings, not men. He had become the sum of what others needed him to be, a mirror reflecting their fascination with power and downfall. In that way, he had never truly stopped being useful. As the years advanced, he found a strange companionship in this distortion. It meant that his name would outlive him, even if the truth did not. And perhaps that was enough. History, he thought, is written not by those who live it, but by those who narrate it. Maybe all he had ever done was create a story worth retelling, even if retelling required forgetting. Yet late at night, when the noise of the city dulled to a whisper, he sometimes wondered what his life would have looked like without the need to prove anything. To the world, to Bumpy, to himself. He thought of the boy who had once dreamed of escape, who had looked at the passing trains and believed freedom was somewhere else. That boy had never wanted an empire. He'd only wanted to stop feeling small. There was one interview that stayed with him. A journalist, younger than his grandchildren, had asked him, "Do you regret it all?" Frank had paused, looking at the recorder on the table, its small red light blinking like an impatient heart. "Regret?" he said slowly. "Regret is for people who think they could have done something different. I did exactly what I knew how to do. The world taught me the rules. I just played them better than most." The journalist nodded, perhaps thinking he was being defiant, but Frank wasn't defending himself. He was confessing to inevitability. The world, he had realized, rewards its monsters until they stop being useful. After that, it replaces them with new ones. Still, there were times when he allowed himself to feel the ache of memory as something human rather than historical. A photograph of his mother, the smell of rain on asphalt, the sound of church bells in the distance, faint but steady. These were the moments that broke through the myth, reminding him that life at its simplest was never about power or legacy, but presence. He had lived so long inside control that he had forgotten how to simply exist within the passing of time. Now, in his old age, time had become his last teacher, stripping him of importance until all that was left was awareness. One night he stood by the window, the city lights trembling like stars scattered too close to the earth. He thought about how strange it was that people still used his story to measure ambition, to moralize about greed and redemption. They missed the real lesson, that control is just another illusion, that every empire, lawful or criminal, is built on the same fragile need to be seen. He smiled faintly, whispering to himself, "They'll never understand. They don't want to." Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of laughter from a passing car, brief and carefree, vanishing into the hum of the city. He turned off the television, leaving the room in darkness, except for the glow from the streetlights seeping through the blinds. The silence that filled the space was not the silence of guilt or solitude, but of acceptance. The story of Frank Lucas had already been written and rewritten. The man himself was now just a footnote, a quiet shadow living among the myths made in his name. And in that shadow, he found something he had never known during all his years of power. Peace, not as victory, but as surrender. The darkness in the room lingered long after he turned off the television. It was a soft, weightless dark, the kind that settles not as a threat, but as an understanding. Frank stood for a while, letting his eyes adjust to it, the faint outlines of furniture emerging like quiet memories. The window pane reflected him faintly, a face marked by time, but steady. For years, people had spoken of his redemption as though it were something to be achieved, a condition one could reach by confessing at the right volume. He had smiled politely when they used the word, but deep down he knew redemption was not an arrival. It was an endless process, a conversation with the ghosts one has created. He had been speaking to those ghosts more often now, though not in the way of religion or guilt. They appeared in small moments, a turn of light on the street, the sound of a saxophone from a bar 2 blocks away, the memory of a laugh long since swallowed by years. They were not accusatory. They simply existed, like echoes of the lives his own had touched and broken. In those moments, he found himself talking softly to the air, not asking forgiveness, but explaining. "I thought I was building something real," he would whisper, "something that would last." And sometimes he would imagine the city answering him in its quiet, constant hum. Nothing lasts, not even the noise of our mistakes. He had begun to spend his days differently. The community center still called him now and then, asking him to speak to the young men who came through its doors. At first he had resisted, believing he had nothing left to offer except caution, and caution rarely inspires. But the director, a woman with kind eyes and a firm voice, told him, "You don't have to teach them what to do, Mr. Lucas. Just tell them what it cost." That line had stayed with him. The cost, he realized, had not been his arrest, nor his wealth, nor even his reputation. The real cost had been time, the years spent building walls of control around himself until he could no longer feel the wind on the other side. So he began to talk again, not like a teacher, but like a man trying to remember what it felt like to speak honestly. His words came slower now, stripped of the certainty that once made them sharp. The young men listened, some skeptical, some curious. "You don't regret the money?" one of them asked once, his tone almost challenging. Frank smiled faintly. "Money was never the problem," he said. "It's what you trade for it that ruins you." They nodded, though he knew most wouldn't understand until it was too late. Understanding, he thought, comes only after you've lost what you thought you were saving. After those sessions, he often walked home under the dim glow of streetlights. The city had grown quieter in his old age, or perhaps he had. The rhythm of its heart no longer beat against his chest the way it once did. He moved slowly now, each step measured, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. He watched people, couples laughing, delivery men shouting, teenagers running across intersections, and he saw in them the same patterns that had always defined life: ambition, desire, survival. Nothing had changed, only the faces. Humanity, he thought, was addicted to its own repetition. Each generation believed it was inventing the same mistakes anew. In solitude, he had come to appreciate the small, ordinary miracles of living: the smell of bread from a bakery, the sudden warmth of sunlight through clouded glass, the simple rhythm of breathing without reason. He realized that these moments had always been available to him, even at the height of his power, but he had been too busy mastering the world to notice that the world required no mastery at all. It moved on its own, and the only true peace was learning to move with it. Sometimes he would catch himself smiling at nothing, and that small, quiet act felt like a victory greater than any he had known. Yet even as peace took root, the past remained present, not as guilt, but as history. He knew that his name would never escape its shadow. He was both legend and warning, his story recited in classrooms, in films, in whispered admiration and moral lessons. He no longer tried to correct the record. The truth, he had learned, was like water. Once released, it finds its own path. What mattered now was not what others believed, but what he could finally believe about himself. He had spent a lifetime convincing the world that he was in control. Now he had to learn how to be without it. Sometimes, late at night, he would light a candle on his kitchen table and sit in its flickering glow, letting the silence stretch. The flame reminded him of the delicate balance between persistence and surrender. It burned not because it fought the air, but because it accepted it. He thought about how strange it was that he had needed so many years, so much loss to understand something so simple. He whispered to himself, maybe this is what redemption looks like. Not forgiveness, but understanding. The word understanding lingered on his tongue, softer than prayer. There was a small church near his apartment where he sometimes went to sit, though he never joined the service. The pastor, an old man with a voice like gravel, greeted him each time with the same phrase, "Glad to see you here, brother." Frank would nod and take his seat in the back row, his hands resting on his cane, his gaze unfocused. The choir would sing, their voices rising like breath from the earth. He did not pray. He simply listened. The music had a way of reaching into him, into the spaces where words could no longer go. It was not salvation he found there, but presence, a reminder that existence itself, however flawed, was a kind of grace. On certain mornings, when the sky was still pale and empty, he would make his way to the park and sit on a bench as the city woke around him. The pigeons gathered, the air filled with the smell of wet concrete, and the first rays of sunlight spilled through the trees. He would watch the day begin without rushing to meet it. The world no longer demanded anything of him, and that absence of demand was its own mercy. Sometimes a stranger would sit beside him, and they would exchange polite greetings, two lives intersecting briefly before drifting apart again. It felt right, that impermanence, the quiet truth that connection doesn't need to last to be real. The years were softening him now, not with weakness, but with gentleness. His voice had grown quieter, but his thoughts clearer. He had no more need to justify, no more urge to deny. When people asked him what he thought of his legacy, he would shrug slightly and say, "It was a life. It had weight, and then it didn't." The simplicity of the answer often startled them, as if they expected a confession dressed in poetry. But Frank had long since lost the taste for performance. Life, stripped of noise, required no audience. One night, while sitting alone with the city stretching before him like an old song, he thought of Bumpy Johnson again, the way the old man's eyes had carried both wisdom and exhaustion. He realized finally that Bumpy had known the truth all along. Every empire ends not when it is defeated, but when its creator grows tired. He smiled at the thought, a smile of recognition, not regret. "I'm tired now," he whispered to the empty room, the sound barely audible even to himself. The words were not surrender. They were peace. Outside, rain began to fall, soft and rhythmic against the glass. Frank sat back, closing his eyes, listening. The sound was steady, endless, familiar. It was the same rain that had once fallen on his mother's porch, the same that had washed the Harlem streets of his youth, the same that now whispered against the windows of his quiet redemption. It was as if the world, in all its vastness, had circled back to remind him that everything in the end returns to stillness. The rain lingered through the night, a slow, patient rhythm that carried through the hours like a pulse buried beneath the city's skin. Frank sat by the window and watched the drops trace uneven paths down the glass, each one catching the faint light of the street lamp outside before disappearing into nothing. It reminded him of time, how it glimmered briefly, made itself seen, then slipped away unnoticed. Legacy, he thought, was just another word for the stains that time leaves behind. People spent their lives chasing the idea of being remembered, but memory was never truth. It was a shape carved by those who came later, molded by what they needed to believe. He had lived long enough to see himself turned into an emblem of contradiction, half villain, half visionary, each version depending on who was doing the remembering. And perhaps that was the truest punishment, to be misremembered beautifully. He thought of the stories told about him now, not the ones whispered in fear when he ruled Harlem, but the ones printed in books, spoken in classrooms, filmed for entertainment. His name had become shorthand for power, for cunning, for the myth of control. But what none of those stories could capture was the emptiness that lay beneath the surface, the hollow center that power built itself around. People wanted their legends clean, their morals clear. They needed their monsters to stand alone, separate from the world that made them. Frank knew better. He had not been born wicked. He had been born observant. He had studied a system that thrived on inequality and learned how to master it. The world had rewarded him for understanding its cruelty, then condemned him for succeeding within it. That was the symmetry of it all, the hypocrisy baked into history's retelling. He sometimes wondered what the city truly remembered. Did Harlem, beneath its new coat of glass and commerce, still hum with echoes of its old hunger? Did the young men who now sold clothes instead of dope, who rapped about kings and hustlers without knowing their names, sense the ghosts that walked beside them? Or had the past finally dissolved into myth, stripped of all its pain and blood? He wasn't sure which was worse, to be remembered for the wrong reasons or to be forgotten completely. There was a strange dignity in anonymity, but also a quiet grief. He had lived a life that had shaped an era, and now that era existed only as nostalgia, sanitized for consumption. When he was invited to speak for a film symposium discussing the ethics of crime cinema, he went mostly out of curiosity. The auditorium was filled with young faces, their expressions attentive but detached, the way people look when they are more interested in ideas than experience. The moderator, an earnest professor, introduced him as the man behind the myth, a phrase that made him smile inwardly. He listened as others debated morality and representation, discussing him as though he were a character rather than a man. When it was finally his turn to speak, he leaned into the microphone, his voice quiet but steady. "You talk about me like I'm a story someone wrote," he said. "But I'm not a story. I was just a man doing what the world allowed me to do. The rest of it, the legend, the lessons, that's yours. You can keep it." The room fell silent, the kind of silence that isn't applause but something deeper, a momentary confrontation with truth. He thanked them politely and left before the discussion resumed. Walking back through the city afterward, he thought about how people mistake clarity for redemption. They wanted his reflection to teach them something, to make sense of the messiness of life through the neatness of narrative. But he knew that life resisted structure. It moved in spirals, not lines. The same streets where he had built his empire were still filled with new empires, new hustles, new dreams. The form had changed, but the essence had not. The world still measured success by dominance, still mistook control for wisdom, still forgave cruelty when it wore a suit. He had simply played the game earlier when the rules were less polite. At home, he sorted through a box of old photographs, his family, his mother, faces blurred at the edges by time. Each image seemed to contain a version of himself he no longer recognized. There he was, smiling with his brothers before ambition fractured them. There he stood beside Juliana, both of them looking in different directions even then. He turned the photographs over one by one, tracing the faint handwriting on the backs. Memory, he realized, was not just about what we preserve, but about what we choose to ignore. For every picture he kept, there were hundreds he had destroyed, moments too raw or too dangerous to survive. Perhaps that was how legacy worked, not as a record of truth, but as a curated silence. Sometimes, when the past felt too heavy, he walked through Central Park early in the morning before the city woke. The air there was gentler, the sounds more forgiving. He would sit on a bench beneath the old elms and watch the light change through the leaves. The pigeons gathered, indifferent to who he had been. Children's laughter echoed faintly in the distance. For brief stretches of time, he felt almost invisible again, but this time the invisibility was peace, not power. He no longer needed to command the world. He only needed to observe it. That, he realized, was his truest redemption, the ability to exist without bending the world to his will. Still, the world had a way of reminding him that it had not forgotten completely. Once, while waiting in line at a small grocery, he overheard two men arguing about morality and ambition. One of them mentioned his name, saying, "That man knew how to make something from nothing. You can't hate that." The other shook his head. "Yeah, but he sold poison. Doesn't matter how smart you are when you kill your own." They both had a point, he thought. He had spent his life living in the space between those two sentences, never entirely one, never entirely the other. That was the paradox of legacy. It belonged as much to your enemies as to your admirers. At home that evening, he sat by the window again. The rain returned, softer now, as if reluctant to leave. He thought about what the word legacy really meant. To most, it was what survived them. But he understood now that legacy was not what people remembered. It was what they misunderstood. Every man leaves behind a distortion of himself, a story told in the wrong language, and maybe that was fitting. Perhaps truth was never meant to survive us. Perhaps it was meant to fade, so the living could build their own myths from our ruins. He stood, stretching his stiff legs, and turned off the light. In the darkness, the city's glow seeped through the blinds, painting faint stripes across the wall. He ran his hand along the surface, feeling the warmth that lingered even in shadow. The past, he thought, was not behind him, but around him, woven into every breath, every silence. It was not a weight anymore, not even a warning. It was simply there, like the faint scent of rain that lingers long after the storm has gone. In the quiet of his later years, the days unfolded like long breaths, slow, deliberate, unremarkable, yet strangely sacred. Frank had grown thin, his shoulders curved slightly forward as if the body had finally decided to match the humility the mind had already accepted. The mornings came softer now. He woke before the alarm, not from habit, but from the body's natural rhythm, the one that grows tender when time no longer hurries. The kettle whistled gently, steam rising in pale ribbons, and he poured the water with the precision of ritual. There was peace in that small act, the same kind of peace he had once sought in power but never found. He would sit at the table with his coffee, watching the light creep across the floor, the day revealing itself without urgency. The city outside still moved with its restless energy, but for him, life had narrowed to what he could hold in a single glance. The dust motes floating in sunlight, the soft rustle of the curtain, the faint hum of the refrigerator. Age had quieted everything except his thoughts, which had grown both sharper and slower, like a knife dulled by use but honed by memory. The body weakened, but the mind, freed from ambition, saw more clearly. He thought often of the faces that had filled his life, not as ghosts or regrets, but as patterns. His mother's steady kindness, Bumpy's measured wisdom, Juliana's quiet sorrow, his brother's laughter before the noise of money drowned it out. They came to him in fragments, moments suspended in amber, without sequence or bitterness. Each face carried its own lesson, each silence its own weight. He realized that the people who shaped him most were the ones who never asked him for anything. It was the others, the ones who needed, wanted, demanded, that had drawn him deeper into the machinery of his own design. Power, he thought now, was not something you held over others. It was what you surrendered when you began to believe in control. His health began to falter in small, merciful increments. The walk to the park grew shorter, the stairs more deliberate, the breaths a touch more precious. But he did not fear the frailty. It felt honest, like the body's final act of truth-telling. He had spent his youth pretending to be invincible, his middle years proving it, and the decades since learning how false the performance had been. Now, as his body reminded him of its limits, he welcomed the simplicity of dependency. The young nurse who came twice a week spoke little, her movements efficient, her voice gentle. He liked her presence, the quiet care, the lack of curiosity. She never asked about the past, never tried to connect the man in front of her to the name that once filled newspapers. To her, he was just Mr. Lucas, an elderly man with a slow gait and a mind that wandered toward abstraction. That anonymity, once a disguise, had become a gift. Sometimes, on warm afternoons, he would sit on the small balcony overlooking the street, a blanket over his knees, a book unopened in his lap. He would watch the people pass, the children with their laughter sharp and fleeting, the mothers carrying groceries, the young men with their phones pressed to their ears, their faces set with determination. The rhythm of life below him was both foreign and familiar. He could see the same hunger, the same restless desire to be more, to escape. It no longer saddened him. Desire, he understood now, was what made life move, even if it also made it burn. He smiled at the thought, remembering how fiercely he had once believed in his own necessity. The city no longer needed him, and yet it continued, unbothered, unchanged in its essence. That was the quiet mercy of time. It erased without cruelty. There were visitors occasionally. A few old friends, older even than he, stopped by out of courtesy more than connection. They spoke of the past in half sentences, careful not to linger too long on specifics. The conversations were slow, punctuated by silences that felt heavier than words. Once one of them, a man he had known from the early days, said softly, "You made history, Frank." Frank looked at him for a moment before replying, "No, history made me," and then it moved on. They both laughed, not out of humor but recognition. There was a comfort in knowing that they were survivors of the same vanishing story. When the visitors left, he felt no loneliness, only the quiet satisfaction of closure. He still received letters sometimes, though fewer now. Some were from strangers who had read about him or seen the film, their words filled with admiration or condemnation. Others came from men still inside, men who called him Brother Frank and wrote about hope, regret, faith. He read them all, answering only a few. To one man who had written that he wanted to be like him, Frank wrote back a single line, "Be better." He never heard back, and that silence felt right. As his strength waned, his world grew smaller until it fit comfortably within the walls of his apartment. The books, the photographs, the small objects he had kept through the years became the geography of his remaining time. Each item carried a story he no longer needed to tell. The photograph of his mother rested on the nightstand. Her face, even after so many decades, still held the same serenity. He often spoke to her softly before sleep, not as prayer, but as habit. "You were right," he would whisper. "You can't fight the world forever." And sometimes in that thin veil between wakefulness and dream, he imagined her sitting beside him again, shelling beans on the porch, her voice humming through the still air. The city outside changed with the seasons. He could tell by the sounds, the laughter of children fading into the sharp quiet of winter, the rhythm of rain giving way to the brittle crackle of snow. Time moved without him now, and he found that comforting. He no longer measured days by plans or events, but by the subtle transitions of light. Morning, afternoon, evening, night. The world breathed, and he breathed with it. Even memory began to lose its sharpness, not from forgetfulness, but from mercy. The edges softened, the details blurred, and what remained was essence, warmth, sound, motion. It was enough. On one of his final evenings of clarity, he sat with the nurse as she prepared his medicine. "Do you ever get tired of hearing the same stories?" he asked her suddenly. She smiled, shaking her head. "I like hearing them," she said. "It means people are still trying to make sense of their lives." Frank nodded slowly, his eyes unfocused on something distant. "I spent a long time making sense of mine," he murmured. "Maybe too long." She adjusted the blanket over his knees and said gently, "You seem at peace." He thought about that for a moment before replying, "Peace isn't what I found. It's what found me after I stopped looking." That night he dreamt of North Carolina. The fields were green again, endless and alive under the sun. He saw himself as a boy, barefoot, running along the tracks as a train approached, the whistle echoing across the horizon. He could feel the wind pulling at his clothes, the earth trembling beneath his feet. When the train passed, it left behind a trail of dust and warmth, and he stood there smiling, the sound fading into the distance. It was not nostalgia he felt in the dream, but a sense of return, of completion. The circle had closed. When morning came, the nurse found him sitting peacefully in his chair by the window, the book still open on his lap, his head tilted slightly, as though he were listening to something far away. The rain had returned, falling lightly against the glass. The city moved on below, unaware. The morning light entered the room softly, thin and uncertain, as though it were reluctant to disturb the stillness. The nurse paused in the doorway, sensing before she knew that something irreversible had taken place. Frank sat, as he always did, in the old chair by the window, wrapped in the same blanket that had become part of his daily uniform. The book rested on his lap, his hand still touching its open page as though caught mid-thought. The line of his mouth was calm, his posture untroubled. Outside, the rain fell in gentle rhythm against the glass, and the city carried on, unaware that one of its most intricate stories had quietly come to its end. There was no drama, no gasp, no gesture toward the infinite, only the simple stillness of a man who had outlived his need for control. She called the ambulance as protocol required, but she did so slowly, with a kind of reverence, whispering his name once before turning away. When the medics arrived, they moved efficiently, their voices low, their steps soft on the wooden floor. There was nothing left to do. They carried him out carefully, as though movement might disturb the peace he had finally found. Outside, the street was washed clean from the night's rain, the air damp and cool. A few neighbors watched from windows, curious but not knowing who he was. To them, he was just another old man leaving the world without ceremony. The anonymity of his final moment was fitting. He had once commanded headlines. Now he departed into silence. The apartment remained untouched for days after, the smell of coffee still faint in the air, the clock still ticking steadily on the wall. The nurse returned briefly to pack a few of his belongings, pausing often as though expecting him to speak. On the nightstand, beside his mother's photograph, she found a small envelope addressed to no one. Inside was a single sheet of paper, bearing a few lines written in his unsteady but still precise hand. It read, "Everything I built was noise. What mattered came in silence. Don't chase the world, listen to it. It will tell you what you need to know." There was no signature, no date, no hint of to whom the words were meant to speak, perhaps to the city, perhaps to himself. She folded it carefully and placed it back where she found it. News of his passing reached the papers a week later. The headline was brief, almost reluctant. "Frank Lucas, former Harlem kingpin, dies at 88." The article recounted the usual facts: his rise from poverty, his reign over the heroin trade, his eventual cooperation with law enforcement, his years in prison, his later attempts at reform. There were quotes from historians, from former detectives, from journalists who had built careers from retelling his story. Some called him brilliant, others ruthless. Few mentioned the quiet years that followed, the long stretch of time in which he lived as no one, walking through the city as invisible as he had once been omnipresent. In that omission, there was a strange truth. The world had always preferred his myth to his reality. Those who had known him, the handful still alive, reacted with quiet acknowledgement. There were no grand eulogies, no processions, no spectacle. A small service was held in a modest chapel in Newark, attended by a few family members, a pastor who had once prayed with him, and a scattering of faces from a time long gone. The service was brief, the hymns soft, the air scented faintly with incense and dust. The pastor spoke of forgiveness, of transformation, of the mystery of grace. Frank's daughter, now gray-haired herself, sat near the front, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She did not cry. Her face bore the calm of someone who had long made peace with loss. When it was time, they lowered the coffin gently into the ground, the sound of rain mingling with the shovel's steady rhythm. No cameras, no reporters, no crowd, just the earth receiving one of its own. Afterward, the city moved on, as it always does. His name surfaced briefly in conversations, in late-night documentaries, in casual references during lectures or interviews. People argued again about what he represented: corruption, brilliance, the failure of systems, the ingenuity of survival. Some claimed he was a product of circumstance. Others insisted he was an architect of his own downfall. Both were true, and neither was enough. What few understood was that the story of Frank Lucas was not about crime or punishment, but about the fragile architecture of human need, the endless struggle to matter, to be seen, to carve order out of chaos. In that sense, his life was less a cautionary tale than a mirror held up to a restless world. Years later, a young writer researching Harlem's history found a photograph of him in an old newspaper archive. The image was faded, but his eyes, even blurred by time, still held that peculiar mix of intelligence and distance. The writer clipped the image, placing it in her notes beside the stories of musicians, activists, and dreamers who had shaped the same streets. She paused for a long time, studying his face, then wrote beneath it, "A man who understood the cost of power and paid it in silence." It was a line that would never be published, but it stayed with her. The past, she realized, is never truly gone. It lingers in the quiet corners of memory, reshaping itself in the minds of those who dare to look closely. The apartment where he died was eventually emptied, cleaned, and rented again. New tenants moved in, filling it with laughter, arguments, the noise of ordinary living. The walls that had once held the weight of reflection now absorbed the sounds of a new story. Outside, the city continued to hum, as constant and indifferent as the tide. Harlem's skyline glowed against the evening sky, each light a pulse in the long, unbroken rhythm of existence. Somewhere among that vast expanse, the echo of Frank's life still flickered, faint, untraceable, but real. If there was an afterlife, he might have imagined it not as paradise or punishment, but as the endless continuation of sound, the murmur of trains, the whisper of rain, the low hum of a city that never stops breathing. In that infinite rhythm, he would find his place, not as a king or a sinner, but as part of the vast pulsing story of human striving. And perhaps, if one were to walk those streets on a quiet night, beneath the heavy hush of dusk, they might still feel it. The faint vibration of a life once lived at the edge of control, now dissolved into the fabric of time. Somewhere, the rain eased, and the city exhaled. The silence that followed was not an ending, but an inheritance. a reminder that every empire, every legend, every man returns to the same truth. All that remains, in the end, is the echo.